Welcome back, Silent Science World, to this quiet corner of the evening, where we slow everything down and wander together into a subject that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Tonight we turn our attention to ferns, plants so old that they were already spreading their fronds across the planet long before the first flower ever opened, long before the first bee ever hummed toward a blossom, and long before the earliest dinosaurs ever set foot beneath a canopy of leaves. At first they seem unremarkable, soft, green, the kind of plant you walk past without a second glance. But the closer you look, the stranger and more wonderful they become. These are plants that unroll from tight spirals instead of simply unfolding. They spread without ever producing a single seed. They cling to cliffs, hang from treetops, drift on ponds, and push their way through cracks in old stone walls. Some can be burned to blackened stubs and return again after rain. Some can dry into what looks like death and green again within a day. Wherever they grow in numbers, they can make an entire forest feel as though it belongs to a much older chapter of the world's story. The deeper you travel into their world, the more layered it becomes. Underneath every frond lies a long history of survival, reinvention, and almost unimaginable patience. These are not simply the quiet background plants we tend to imagine. They are living remnants of an older Earth, still growing quietly all around us, still finding new corners of the world to fill. If a slow, gentle exploration like this is the kind of thing that helps you unwind, feel free to let the people who made it know. A small note, a follow, a share, anything that helps this kind of calm reach someone else searching for the same kind of rest. But for now, there's nothing you need to do except settle back, let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow, and allow your thoughts to drift along with us as we step into this ancient green world together. Let's begin. Ferns were already ancient by the time the very first dinosaurs appeared. Long before towering reptiles walked the earth, long before wide grasslands rolled across the continents, long before most of what we picture as prehistoric life had even taken shape, fern lineages were already an established part of the planet's greenery. They belong to one of the oldest branches on the tree of plant life, a branch that helped define entire landscapes in a world almost too distant to properly imagine. This is part of what gives them such a strange gravity. When you kneel beside a fern today, you are not looking at some passing botanical trend. You are looking at the descendant of a lineage that predates the age of giant reptiles altogether. Across colossal stretches of time, continents drifted apart and reassembled. Climates swung from steaming warmth to bitter cold, and extinction after extinction swept entire branches of life away. And still, this lineage endured. The exact species have changed again and again. Countless ancient relatives are long gone, but the broader thread never broke. That gives every single frond a quiet kind of weight. It is not simply green decoration beside a garden path. It is a living thread connecting us to a planet so unfamiliar, so distant in time, that even dinosaurs were, in a sense, latecomers to the party. Ferns manage something that sounds almost contradictory. They build entire forests without flowers, without fruit, and without seeds. That feels almost impossible at first, because we've been trained to think that successful plants need blossoms, pollen carried on the legs of bees, and seeds tucked safely into fruit or cones. Ferns prove there was another way. They built their place in the world using an older toolkit entirely. Instead of flowers, they release spores. Instead of fruit, they rely on wind, dampness, timing, and staggering numbers. In humid forests, that approach works beautifully. Whole hillsides, gullies, and stream banks can become thick with fronds, and the result is a landscape that feels lush, layered, and complete, without a single petal anywhere in sight. There's something almost startling about that fact once you sit with it. An ecosystem can look abundant and finished while relying on none of the reproductive machinery most of us associate with a healthy, thriving garden. It's a quiet reminder that the flowering world we know so well is only one version of botanical success, not the only one. Some ferns take this even further, launching their spores like miniature spring-loaded catapults. On the underside of certain fronds, spores are held inside microscopic capsules. As those capsules begin to dry out, a ring of specialized cells along their edge starts to tighten under building strain. Moisture loss slowly changes the tension in the cell walls until, all at once, the structure snaps backward and the capsule bursts open, flinging spores outward with surprising force. This is a genuine mechanical launch, powered entirely by tension building inside living tissue. There are no muscles involved, no nervous system, nothing that resembles animal movement in any conventional sense. And yet the result is sudden and dramatic. Under magnification, it looks almost like watching a trap spring shut in reverse. It's easy to think of ferns as calm, unhurried woodland plants, but tucked beneath many of their leaves is a tiny ballistic mechanism, quietly firing the next generation into the open air. A single leaf can carry thousands of these miniature launchers, each one waiting patiently for the right combination of dryness and tension before its one sudden release. Tree ferns can make an entire rainforest feel prehistoric. There are moments in certain wet forests when the whole landscape seems to slip backward through time, and tree ferns are very often the reason why. They rise on shaggy, fibrous trunks, crowned with huge umbrella-like sprays of fronds casting silhouettes that feel far older than the world around them. Some species reach heights that completely upend the usual picture of a fern as a small, low-growing plant, turning it instead into something almost architectural. Yet their trunks aren't built the way an oak or a pine builds wood. Instead, the upright stem is supported by dense fibrous tissue and a tangled mass of roots, giving the whole structure a strange and wiry strength. In misty valleys and tropical ravines, these towering forms can dominate the entire scene, and you don't need much imagination to feel the atmosphere shift around you. They genuinely change the mood of a place. Step among them, and the forest stops feeling merely lush and starts to feel ancient, as though an older chapter of Earth's story has simply never come to a close. Deep in geological time, ferns and their close relatives helped blanket the planet in vast, steaming swamp forests. Enormous wetlands spread across parts of the ancient world, and fern relatives were among the plants that filled them with dense, towering vegetation. These weren't always the exact same species we recognize today, but they belonged to that same broad, spore-rich family of plants that helped shape those primeval wetlands. Towering growth, waterlogged ground, heavy humid air, and endless green made these ancient swamps some of the most influential ecosystems in the planet's long history. Over unimaginable stretches of time, fallen plant matter piled up in soggy, oxygen-poor conditions where decomposition could never quite finish its work. That buried organic material was slowly compressed and transformed, eventually becoming much of the coal that humans would, ages later, dig up from the ground to fuel entire civilizations. So when you look at a fern today, you're also looking in a strange, indirect way toward a story about ancient atmospheres, buried forests, and the energy history that shaped modern human life. These plants are not simply decorative descendants of a vanished past. Their lineage helped leave a signature buried in stone, a signature that would eventually shape the human future in ways no ancient fern could have imagined. Some ferns manage to survive on bare, exposed rock, where almost nothing else can gain a foothold. It's tempting to assume a fern must need rich woodland soil to thrive, but many species are tougher and far more opportunistic than that picture suggests. They wedge themselves into cracks in stone, cling to cliff faces, and colonize surfaces that look almost completely barren. In these places, there may be barely any true soil at all. Instead, the plant makes use of tiny pockets of dust, moisture, and organic debris that slowly accumulate in crevices over time. A little shade helps enormously. Once established, the fronds can transform a hostile, lifeless-looking surface into something unexpectedly alive. That ability is part of their quiet magic. They don't always wait around for ideal conditions to arrive. They exploit the smallest available opening and slowly turn hard, unforgiving surfaces green. Watching one grow directly out of solid rock can feel almost improbable, as if the plant has simply willed itself away to root in stone. It's a small, patient lesson in persistence and precision. Fern leaves begin their lives coiled into tight spirals known as fiddleheads. Before a frond ever unfurls into its familiar lacy shape, it starts out as a tightly wound coil, curled in on itself for protection. This distinctive shape is one of the most recognizable forms in all of botany, and the unfurling that follows isn't random at all. It follows a very specific pattern of growth, in which the tender, vulnerable tip of the leaf stays protected inside the spiral for as long as possible. That protection matters, because the growing tip is delicate and easily damaged. By keeping it tucked inward, the plant shields its most fragile tissue during the earliest, most vulnerable stage of expansion. Then, slowly, the coil begins to relax. Section by section, the frond reveals its final shape. Watching this happen can feel almost hypnotic, deliberate, almost ceremonial, like a green scroll slowly unrolling from some earlier chapter of the world. Plenty of plants grow leaves. Very few do it with quite this much visible drama. Ferns can be found in deserts, in treetops, along rushing rivers, and pressed between the bricks of old city walls. One of the most fascinating things about this group is that it refuses to stay inside any single ecological box. Yes, most people picture ferns in cool, damp woodlands, and plenty of species do live exactly there. But that's only part of the story. Some species have adapted to endure long stretches of drought in dry, open country. Some live high up on tree branches, catching moisture and drifting debris from the air without ever touching soil at all. Others root themselves along stream banks and river banks, shaped entirely by the rhythm of moving water. And still others turn up in mortar lines, in abandoned wells, in the shaded corners of city streets where almost nobody thinks to look for anything remarkable growing at all. This range gives the whole group a restless, inventive character. There isn't one single fern world. There are countless overlapping ones. You might encounter a fern in a steaming rainforest, another clinging to a rocky desert canyon, and a third wedged between paving stones outside a train station. The underlying family resemblance stays recognizable, but the settings keep shifting beneath it, which is exactly what makes them feel so quietly adaptable. A fern's life doesn't begin as a miniature version of the leafy plant we recognize. It begins as a tiny heart-shaped growth so small it's easy to overlook completely. After a spore lands somewhere sufficiently damp, it doesn't grow directly into a small frond. Instead, it first develops into a flat, delicate structure, often shaped a little like a small green heart, tucked close against moss, soil, or a film of algae on rock. Most people never notice this stage at all. It's often so slight that it simply vanishes into its surroundings. And yet this hidden phase completely reshapes how you think about a fern's life. The leafy plant we admire in a shaded woodland is only one chapter in a much larger cycle that includes an entirely different body altogether. On that small heart-shaped surface, the next generation of the plant actually begins. In a very real sense, the sweeping, arching fronds of a future fern start out as something soft, quiet, and easily missed. A gentle reminder that some of nature's oldest and most important dramas can unfold at a scale small enough to vanish beneath your shoe without you ever knowing it was there. The world holds many thousands of fern species, and even now, after centuries of collecting and careful classification, they continue to surprise the scientists who study them. There are countless known species scattered across the globe, showing extraordinary variation in shape, habitat, texture, and life strategy. Some are instantly recognizable at a glance. Others are so subtle in their differences that even trained specialists struggle to tell them apart. New species are still being described today, especially in remote tropical regions and mountain ranges where plant diversity remains vast and only partially explored. On top of that, fern relationships can be complicated by hybridization and unusual genetic patterns, which means their family tree is rarely as neat and orderly as textbooks might suggest. That ongoing uncertainty is, in a strange way, part of the appeal. These are ancient plants, and yet they are far from a finished subject of study. They still hold real puzzles. They still push scientists to look more closely, question old assumptions, and revise long-held classifications. There's something wonderful in realizing that a plant group this old can still surprise modern science. Ferns are true vascular plants equipped with real roots, stems, and leaves, and that distinction matters more than it might seem at first. A patch of moss can make a stone look green, but a fern is built around an internal transport system, one capable of moving water and dissolved minerals upward through the plant while sending sugars back the other way. It has roots that anchor it firmly and draw up nutrients, stems that support and connect its different parts, and leaves that spread wide to gather as much light as possible. In other words, this isn't a primitive smear of green clinging weakly to damp ground. It's a fully organized land plant, engineered for a genuine life above the soil. That underlying design helped its ancestors participate in one of the great early expansions of life onto land. When you look closely at a single frond, you're really looking at a plant body with internal plumbing, structure, and real physical reach. The overall effect can look soft and delicate, but the architecture underneath is anything but simple. Ferns may feel fragile in the hand, yet their internal anatomy tells a much larger story, one about conquest, adaptation, and quiet botanical invention stretching back further than most of us ever pause to consider. The leafy, arching frond. Most of us picture when we think of a fern is really only one phase in a much longer two-part cycle. That visible, familiar form is the spore-producing generation, and it's built specifically to dominate space, gather light, and hold its ground through changing weather. It carries the reaching fronds, the spreading crowns, and the structural strength to last through an entire season and beyond. This is the public face of a fern, the version that fills woodland shade or spills gracefully from a garden pot. It's also the stage that eventually carries the reproductive structures most curious observers notice tucked beneath the leaves. In a sense, this is the large, expressive chapter of the fern's story. What makes the whole arrangement so intriguing is that the familiar plant is neither the beginning nor the end of that story. It's simply one participant in an ongoing handoff, quietly preparing, even while it thrives, to hand things over to another smaller, hidden generation waiting to take its turn. That hidden generation is tiny, delicate, and remarkably easy to overlook. If you went looking for it without any guidance, you could walk straight past it 100 times without noticing. It stays close to the ground, often as thin as a green film, easily mistaken for almost anything except what it actually is. And yet this small, unassuming structure is where one of the most intimate parts of a fern's entire life cycle quietly unfolds. It doesn't tower or branch or spread dramatic fronds of its own. Instead, it stays modest and exposed, depending entirely on the right combination of moisture, shelter, and timing. There's something almost daring in that vulnerability. The grand leafy plant eventually gives way to a form so delicate it seems barely equipped to survive the world at all, and yet it manages, quietly working in hidden corners of soil, bark, or stone. This overlooked generation plays its essential part, then disappears from notice once again, which gives ferns the feeling of leading a kind of secret double life, one large and visible, the other quiet enough to slip entirely out of view. Ferns depend on a thin film of freestanding water for one crucial moment of reproduction, and that single requirement ties their life story firmly back to a much older chapter of land plant history. At a key stage, fertilization depends on tiny swimming cells that must physically travel through a film of moisture to reach the egg. Rain, dew, mist, or simply persistent dampness can make that journey possible. Without that moisture, the entire process stalls. It's a striking detail, because it links reproduction not just to the changing seasons but to the immediate, present conditions of the surrounding world. A fern can look completely rooted and self-sufficient, standing calmly in place, and yet still depend on a thin, temporary pathway of water in order to continue its line at all. That gives the whole cycle a quiet undercurrent of suspense. Somewhere in the damp leaf litter, or on a shaded rock face, the success of an entire generation may hinge on a moisture window so brief that most people would never even notice it passing. Ferns are land plants through and through, but at their most vital moment, they still carry a distinctly watery memory. Many fern spores travel enormous distances on the wind, far beyond anything the eye could ever track. They're so light and so small that once released, they rise into air currents completely invisible to us. From that point on, their journey becomes a matter of turbulence, timing, and pure chance. A spore might settle just a few feet away, in the very same patch of shade it started from. Or it might be carried for miles, over ridges, across rivers, over open water, before finally drifting back down to solid ground. That scale of movement helps explain how ferns so often appear in unexpected places. A freshly built wall, a newly cut roadside bank, a remote gorge, even an isolated island far from any obvious source. There's something quietly thrilling about that invisible traffic passing overhead. Forests, mountains, and coastlines end up connected by microscopic travelers drifting silently through air we usually think of as empty. Most of these spores will fail to find a suitable place to grow. The odds are genuinely brutal, but the strategy was never really about certainty. It's about reach, persistence, and the sheer audacity of trusting the sky to decide. A single frond can carry the beginnings of thousands of future plants. Turn over the right leaf, and you may be looking at a densely packed nursery of pure potential. Those small clusters on the underside can hold an enormous number of spores, each one a possible starting point for an entirely new life cycle. The arithmetic becomes dizzying almost immediately. One plant can produce frond after fertile frond, and each one may release a cloud of spores so fine it passes completely unnoticed by anyone standing nearby. This means a fern isn't relying on a small handful of precious offspring. It floods the odds entirely. The surrounding environment may be harsh, suitable landing sites may be rare, and the vast majority of spores may never amount to anything at all, and yet the sheer scale of the attempt is part of the genius. The plant answers uncertainty with overwhelming abundance. What looks like a single quiet leaf becomes something far more dramatic once you understand exactly what it's carrying, not just tissue and green pigment, but an entire airborne future. Multiplied thousands of times over, tucked away beneath a surface almost nobody ever bothers to inspect. Not every fern spreads primarily through the air. In many species, the real action is happening below ground, where horizontal underground stems push slowly through soil, leaf litter, and crevices, sending up fresh fronds at regular intervals. This can create the illusion of many separate individual plants when, in reality, they're all connected parts of a single continuing organism. It's a very different strategy from casting spores blindly into the wind. Rather than gambling on distance, the plant methodically consolidates territory, inch by inch, in ground it already knows it can survive on. That patient, deliberate expansion can make some fern colonies feel almost like a slow negotiation with the surrounding landscape. The visible fronds you see are really only the surface markers of that ongoing advance. Beneath them, the plant is quietly probing, branching, and steadily claiming new ground in complete darkness. Once you understand that, a settled-looking fern patch stops seeming static. It becomes something closer to a front line, quiet, hidden, and steady, but constantly moving through the earth on its own unhurried schedule. A patch that looks completely settled may actually be expanding the entire time. Beneath the visible cluster of fronds, underground stems can stretch outward and produce fresh growth farther and farther from where they began. The colony slowly enlarges without any obvious dramatic event ever marking the change. One season might reveal only a slight widening at the edges. Another might fill in an entirely new strip of shaded ground beside a rock, a fallen log, or a garden path. Over the course of years, the cumulative effect can be substantial. This slow, steady march is easy to miss precisely because it happens beneath leaf litter and darkness, with no sound and almost no visible sign until the next season's fronds appear. And yet, it can quietly reshape an entire corner of woodland or garden through sheer persistence. What makes this so fascinating is the contrast between the pace and the eventual result. There's nothing about a fern that suggests conquest in any conventional sense. No rush, no sudden burst, no showy takeover. And yet, through this patient underground advance, a colony can transform from a few scattered fronds into a broad, connected sweep of green. Beneath the surface, a fern's underground stems do more than simply spread. They also function as reserves, storing resources that carry the plant through cold seasons, drought, physical damage, or periods when the visible fronds die back completely. That buried storage changes the whole character of the plant. What looks soft, seasonal, and fragile above ground may actually be anchored by a resilient, well-provisioned body hidden below, quietly waiting for better conditions to return. Through a harsh winter or a dry spell, the visible portion of the plant may shrink, fade, or vanish entirely. From the surface, it can genuinely look as though the plant has failed. But underground, the buried stem may remain alive and fully stocked, holding enough stored energy to send up fresh growth the moment moisture, temperature, and light settle back into a favorable balance. There's something deeply reassuring in that design. It's the botanical version of endurance through strategic retreat. The fern doesn't need to win every moment on the surface. It can withdraw into a hidden reserve, hold steady, and reappear the instant the season opens back up again. Many ferns are able to return after fire from protected parts of themselves hidden underground. A blaze can strip away every trace of visible green in a matter of minutes, leaving a slope blackened and seemingly lifeless. And yet for certain species, the story is nowhere near finished. Because their key growing tissues sit safely below the surface, insulated by soil and sheltered from the worst of the heat, they can survive conditions that completely destroy the fronds above. When rain eventually falls and conditions ease, fresh growth may begin pushing up from ground that still looks entirely scorched. That kind of recovery can feel almost uncanny to witness. A burned landscape looks stripped down to nothing but ash, and then, seemingly out of nowhere, small green coils or fresh blades begin appearing, as if the earth itself has quietly decided to reopen. Not every fern is built to withstand fire this way, of course, but many are far better prepared for disturbance than their delicate outward appearance would ever suggest. Their resilience doesn't come from resisting the flames directly. It comes from surviving beneath them. In that sense, a fire doesn't always end a fern's story at all. Sometimes it simply clears the stage, and the plant begins again from the part the flames could never quite reach. Some ferns are true pioneers, among the very first living things to appear on raw volcanic rock or freshly exposed landslide debris. When a volcano leaves bare stone behind, or a slope collapses and strips the ground down to loose, unstable grit, the resulting landscape can look almost completely hostile to life. There's little shelter, almost no organic matter, and nothing that feels soft or welcoming. And yet, these are precisely the kinds of places where certain ferns tend to be among the earliest arrivals. Spores drift in on the wind, tiny particles of dust and moisture begin to collect, and roots start finding purchase in cracks and unstable grit. Their arrival matters enormously because these pioneer plants help start the long, slow process of converting damaged ground into genuine habitat. They trap loose particles, contribute organic material as they grow and die back, and soften the harshest extremes right at the surface. Over time, this can make life possible for a whole range of other organisms that follow behind them. That gives ferns an unexpected role in planetary recovery. They aren't just inhabitants of finished, mature forests. Some of them are among the very first green signatures of return after real violence, whether that violence comes from a cooling lava flow or a freshly scarred hillside. In a sense, they can become part of the opening sentence in an entirely new ecological chapter. Other ferns thrive best in deep shade and constantly dripping air, specialists suited to dim ravines, wet gullies, cloud forests, and stream-carved hollows where sunlight only ever arrives filtered and broken. In habitats like these, moisture hangs thick in the air, surfaces stay perpetually damp, and evaporation slows to a crawl beneath dense overhead cover. Most plants would struggle badly for lack of direct light in a place like this, yet certain ferns seem perfectly tuned to exactly these conditions. Their fronds spread wide into that softened brightness, making full use of whatever light manages to reach them, and the results can be astonishingly rich. Steep banks, rock walls, and forest floors become layered in shades of green of every height and texture, all sustained by a level of shade that might feel far too dark for growth in almost any other plant. That preference gives these species an almost secretive quality. They reward the kind of person willing to step past open, sun-drenched ground and bright flowers, choosing instead to wander into the cool, quiet interior of a landscape. In those shadowed places, ferns often look most completely at home, not weakened by the dimness, but genuinely thriving in it, as though low light and constantly damp air were always exactly the world they were meant for. Diddick ferns live directly on the surface of trees without ever taking nourishment from them. At first glance, it's easy to assume that any plant growing on top of another plant must be some kind of parasite, quietly draining its host. But these ferns are doing something quite different. They use branches and trunks purely as places to live, as elevated real estate offering access to light and passing moisture, not as sources of food. Water collects in the folds of bark, and bits of organic debris gather around their roots and leaf bases, giving the fern just enough to survive entirely on its own, without ever tapping into the tree itself for nourishment. That distinction matters, because it reveals a whole aerial version of plant life hiding in plain sight. In rainforests and humid woodlands, the canopy isn't simply empty space stretching above the ground. It's habitat in its own right. Ferns occupy that upper world with remarkable elegance, treating bark as a living platform for an entire independent existence. Looking up and spotting them perched high overhead is a reminder that a forest is layered in more ways than most people ever stop to consider, with entire botanical lives quietly unfolding well above eye level. Some of these tree-dwelling ferns build a kind of natural basket to trap falling leaves. Their fronds aren't all shaped for the same purpose. In certain species, some fronds are specifically positioned to catch debris drifting down from above, dead leaves, twigs, dust, and other organic materials sifting through the canopy. Over time, that trapped litter accumulates around the base of the plant and slowly begins to break down. In effect, the fern engineers its own small pocket of nutrient-rich material while suspended well above the forest floor. It's a remarkably clever adaptation, because canopy life tends to be rich in light but genuinely poor in access to soil. Rather than waiting around for ideal conditions that may never arrive, the plant simply builds a substitute. It constructs a kind of suspended compost system among the branches. Rainwater filters through, decomposition quietly gets underway, and the fern gains a local, self-generated source of nutrition in a place where its roots could never reach an actual forest floor. It's the kind of adaptation that feels almost startlingly ingenious, a genuine botanical solution to the challenge of living suspended in midair. Bird's nest ferns can hold entire miniature ecosystems suspended overhead. Their broad fronds rise from a central rosette, forming a bowl-like shape that gathers rainwater, leaf litter, fallen seeds, and other drifting fragments of forest life. Over time, that central pocket can become a moist, slowly decomposing reservoir rich enough to support far more than just the fern itself. Insects may shelter there. Small animals may forage through it. Microbes and fungi quietly get to work breaking down the accumulating debris. In some cases, even other plants can begin their own lives within the material gathered inside that leafy basin. What looks from below like a single ornamental plant may, on closer inspection, actually be a suspended habitat, a small, self-contained world held together in the crook of the canopy. That's part of what makes forests so endlessly fascinating. The architecture built by one organism can quietly become living space for a great many others. Bird's nest ferns make that principle especially visible. They don't just occupy the trees around them. They create overhead pockets where water, decay, shelter, and life all gather together in one place. Staghorn ferns grow fronds that look far more like antlers than ordinary leaves, making them some of the most striking examples of just how strange this plant group can become. Instead of the familiar feathered shape most people associate with ferns, these species produce dramatic, branching fronds that fork and spread in ways strongly reminiscent of an animal's antlers. Mounted on tree trunks or displayed on walls, they can look almost creature-like in outline, which is a large part of why they're so memorable. Yet that shape isn't purely decorative. Different fronds actually perform different jobs. Some extend outward to gather light and carry spores, while others form flat, shield-like bases that press against the surface beneath them, helping to collect debris and anchor the plant firmly in place. The result is a plant that looks almost sculptural, as though two entirely different design languages had been fused into one organism. That visual strangeness matters, because it completely breaks the assumption that ferns are all soft variations on the same feathery theme. A staghorn fern can feel bold, architectural, and almost theatrical. A reminder that once you step deeper into fern diversity, familiar expectations tend to fall away very quickly. Filmy ferns take fragility to an entirely different level, with leaves so thin they can seem almost unreal. Some species are built with tissue only a single cell layer thick across much of the leaf blade, which means light can pass directly through it, giving the frond a translucent, glass-like quality. Rather than feeling sturdy and self-contained the way most plants do, it seems almost like living membrane, more whisper than structure. That fragility comes at a real cost. These plants are tied absolutely to places that stay constantly wet, because tissue this thin loses water extremely quickly and simply cannot tolerate any drying out the way tougher, more traditional ferns can. So they tend to live in dripping grottos, spray-soaked zones near waterfalls, saturated ravines, and cloud forests where the air itself is humid enough to keep them alive. Encountering one is a lesson in just how far plant design can travel in the direction of pure delicacy. It can feel as though the fern has been reduced to the bare minimum needed for capturing light and staying alive. And yet, in exactly the right setting, it works beautifully. Not every successful plant needs armor. Some survive by becoming almost unbelievably fine, and some aquatic ferns take that principle out onto open water, floating like green lace across still surfaces. This is an entirely different image from woodland fronds and shaded rock faces. Instead, we find these plants drifting on ponds, rice paddies, marshy backwaters, and other calm bodies of water. Certain species live directly on the surface itself, forming loose mats or scattered drifts that seem almost too delicate to belong to the same broad plant lineage as towering tree ferns or rugged cliff dwellers. Their structures are adapted for buoyancy and a life spent entirely at the surface, where light is abundant and movement is largely dictated by current, breeze, and crowding from neighboring plants. Seen from above, they can look like delicate embroidery scattered across the water. And yet these floating communities can also be ecologically significant, shading the surface below, interacting with available nutrients, and shifting conditions for the other organisms sharing that same water. What makes them so captivating is the contrast they represent. The very same broad lineage that includes towering tree ferns and hardy cliff specialists also includes these tiny floating forms, a reminder that ferns aren't locked into any single style of life. They can even turn a still, quiet pond into a drifting world entirely their own. One particularly tiny floating fern is small enough to carpet an entire pond on its own. This diminutive plant can multiply so effectively that an open water surface may disappear beneath it completely, replaced instead by what looks like a continuous sheet of red or green. Because each individual plant is so small, the collective effect can be genuinely startling. A quiet pond transformed into a living skin. Under the right conditions, that spread can happen quickly enough to change the appearance of an entire wetland corner within a remarkably short span of time. But the real fascination runs deeper than its appearance. This particular fern lives in close partnership with nitrogen-fixing microorganisms, meaning it takes part in a genuinely remarkable biological alliance. Those microbes help supply usable nitrogen to the surrounding water, which has made the fern genuinely important in certain agricultural systems, particularly in traditional rice cultivation. It's a tiny floating plant with consequences that reach far beyond its size. There's something wonderful in that. A fern so small that most people would never notice a single individual can still quietly reshape landscapes, support entire farming traditions, and blanket open water in a way that feels almost magical when viewed from the shore. Giant ferns and tiny ferns both belong to the very same broad lineage, and that enormous range is one of the best reasons to take the whole group seriously. Within this single branch of plant life, you can travel from species that tower over wet tropical forests to species so small they seem like little more than green punctuation on bark, soil, or open water. The contrast is extraordinary. We often assume that ancient lineages must be narrow or conservative, as though age alone should make a group cautious and uniform. Ferns prove the exact opposite. Across immense spans of time, they've diversified into forms that occupy radically different scales and settings. Some command entire landscapes, others nearly disappear into them completely. Some create the mood of an entire primeval forest all on their own. Others live out their whole existence in a space no larger than the palm of your hand, and yet all of them are linked through the very same deep evolutionary heritage. That makes the group feel both coherent and wildly expansive at the same time. Once you fully absorb this, the word fern stops describing a single familiar shape and starts to feel like an entire universe of possibility. Many fern fronds divide again and again, forming intricate lacework. Some fronds seem less like ordinary leaves and more like architecture built out of green thread. A central stalk gives rise to smaller leaflets, and those leaflets divide once more, sometimes dividing yet again, until the whole structure becomes a living pattern of ribs, gaps, and moving shadow. This repeated branching is one reason ferns can look so intricate, even while accomplishing something fairly simple, spreading surface area out to catch as much light as possible. The result is both practical and genuinely beautiful. Air moves easily through the fine divisions, rain passes cleanly through the structure, and light gets gathered across a wide area without the leaf ever needing to become one heavy, solid blade. In woodland shade, that lacework catches the light in a way that feels almost deliberate, as though the plant had been cut with exquisite care. It also gives many species their unmistakable, effortless elegance. You don't need any technical knowledge of botany to feel the effect. One glance is often enough to make a fern look crafted, rather than simply grown. Not every fern follows this delicate, divided pattern, though. Some fronds are entirely simple and whole, with almost no divisions at all. That can come as a surprise if your mental image of a fern is always feathery and deeply cut. Certain species abandon that look almost entirely, growing leaves that are long and strap-like, broad and undivided, or shaped in bold, clean forms that make them look more like tropical foliage plants than the delicate lace most people expect from this group. This matters because it breaks a common assumption. Ferns aren't a single shape repeated endlessly across the world. They're a full spectrum, and some members of that spectrum are striking precisely because of how restrained they are. A whole undivided frond can look calm, solid, and almost modern in outline, and yet it belongs to exactly the same ancient lineage as the most delicately divided lace forms. In wet forests, on tree trunks, or in carefully arranged gardens, these simple shapes can still carry a dramatic presence. They're a reminder that fern beauty doesn't always come from complexity. Sometimes the real fascination lies in the opposite direction entirely, in a leaf so spare and self-assured that it barely needs any ornament at all. Fern textures range from tough, leathery resilience all the way to a softness as thin as paper. Touch a handful of different species, and the sheer variety becomes impossible to ignore. One might feel firm and resilient, clearly built to withstand drying winds and rough exposure. Another might feel so delicate that even the lightest touch seems too heavy for it. This range tells you a great deal about where each kind of fern actually belongs in the world. Thick, leathery fronds tend to suit harsher conditions, where reliable water can't always be counted on and surfaces are more exposed to sun and wind. Softer fronds tend to belong to places where the air stays consistently moist and the risk of drying out stays low. In other words, texture isn't just a pleasant sensory detail. It's a genuine clue to lifestyle, geography, and long-term strategy. That makes fern surfaces far more interesting than they might first appear. A frond isn't simply green tissue arranged into a pleasing shape. It's a physical record of the exact conditions it evolved to survive. Once you notice that, you start reading texture almost the way you might read fur, feathers, or bark, as evidence of a hidden way of life quietly written into the plant itself. Some fern fronds shine with a distinctly metallic or bluish cast, refusing to settle for ordinary green. In certain species, the surface catches light in a way that gives the frond a silvery, steely, or blue-tinged quality, as though the plant had somehow borrowed its color palette from moonlight or polished metal. Sometimes the effect comes from a fine coating of natural wax. Sometimes it's tied to the way light reflects off the internal structure of the tissue itself. Whatever the underlying cause, the visual result can be genuinely startling. A patch of these fronds can seem to glow with a coolness quite unlike the deeper greens surrounding it, standing apart from the rest of the forest. That unusual sheen gives these particular ferns a slightly unreal presence, especially in dappled, filtered light where every small shift of angle changes the impression entirely. It's the kind of detail that makes a person stop and look twice. We tend to think of ferns as subtle, understated plants, and very often they are, and yet some of them seem to flirt with an entirely different register altogether. Not loud in the way flowers are loud, but strange, cool, and quietly luminous in their own understated way. Young fronds unfurl in one of the most graceful movements found anywhere in the plant world. There's no sudden burst, no dramatic flowering, no bright signal to announce the moment is happening. Instead, the process unfolds with real patience. A tightly coiled tip begins to loosen, then gradually lengthens, then opens section by section as the frond expands slowly into its mature form. Watching this happen can feel almost hypnotic, because the movement seems choreographed rather than simply biological. It has direction, rhythm, and an unmistakable sense of quiet revelation. The final form is always there, packed tightly inside the coil, patiently waiting to be drawn outward into open space. That's part of why people find the process so memorable. Its growth made genuinely visible in a way most plants never offer so clearly. The young leaf doesn't simply appear fully formed, it unfurls, and in doing so turns ordinary development into something close to a performance. In gardens, forests, and even on quiet greenhouse benches, this slow opening can make a fern feel oddly theatrical, as though you're watching a plant become itself right in front of you, one measured release at a time. The spiral shape of a fiddlehead follows an ancient, deeply efficient growth geometry. That curled form isn't decorative whim. It emerges from a pattern that packs an enormous amount of structure into a compact space while keeping the vulnerable growing tip tucked safely inward as the rest of the leaf slowly elongates behind it. The geometry protects the growing point, and allows the expanding frond to unroll in a smooth, controlled sequence. Nature returns again and again to spiral shapes because they solve certain problems with real elegance, and ferns offer one of the clearest examples anywhere in the living world. There's something almost mathematical about the coil, and yet it never feels cold or mechanical. It feels old, inevitable, and strangely satisfying to look at. Perhaps that's exactly why people respond to fiddleheads so strongly. They seem to carry a sense of built-in order, as though the plant is following a design principle older than any forest path where you might happen to encounter it. When a frond finally loosens from that tight spiral, you're watching geometry translated directly into living tissue, a shape that protects, organizes, and quietly reveals the intelligence embedded deep within plant growth itself. Some fern fronds can grow taller than a full-grown person, stand beside one of the great tropical or subtropical species, and the sheer scale can be genuinely startling. What you might have assumed was a modest background plant suddenly becomes a structure large enough to cast real shade, frame an entire pathway, or arch overhead like a living green roof. That size changes your emotional response as much as your visual one. Smaller ferns invite close inspection. These larger ones invite something closer to immersion. You don't simply look at them, you move among them. Their broad blades spread outward with a kind of quiet authority that makes the whole surrounding landscape feel older and wetter, almost as though the air itself belongs to another climate entirely. And because the leaf remains unmistakably a fern frond, the effect only grows stronger. A familiar pattern rendered at completely unfamiliar scale. A shape you'd normally associate with delicate ground-level plants suddenly becomes monumental. That shift is exactly why giant fronds leave such a lasting impression. They take something intimate and expand it until it begins to shape the entire atmosphere of a place. At the opposite end of the scale, some ferns are smaller than a child's fingernail. These species can be missed even by the most careful, attentive eyes. A person might scan an entire wall, a damp bank, or a patch of soil and never realize a complete, fully functioning fern is living there in miniature. These small forms don't impress through mass or drama. They impress through precision. Everything the lineage normally does, from leaf making to reproduction, is condensed into a body so slight it can occupy the space between grains of soil, tiny crumbs of moss, or the finest crack in a rock face. That smallness has a powerful effect on how you think about the group as a whole. It means fern life isn't only a story of lush ravines and towering fronds. It's also a story of near invisibility, of survival at a scale where a few millimeters can mean the entire difference between exposure and shelter. Finally, noticing one of these tiny species can feel almost like discovering an entire forest reduced to a whisper, complete in every structural detail but almost impossibly small. Fern spores often gather in neat, orderly dots across the underside of the leaf. To many people, the underside of a frond is where the plant suddenly becomes far more interesting than it first appeared. What looked from above like a purely decorative leaf reveals rows or clusters of tiny marks, often brown, gold, blackish, or rust-colored depending on the species and its stage of maturity. At first glance, they can seem almost like blemishes or insect damage. Then you realize they're part of the reproductive design itself, arranged with a tidiness that can feel almost printed onto the leaf surface. This hidden pattern completely changes the experience of looking at a fern. The upper side offers shape and texture. The lower side offers a kind of secret map. In that sense, a fern rewards genuine curiosity in a very direct, tactile way. Turn the leaf over, and the plant instantly becomes more complex than it first appeared. There's something quietly thrilling in that discovery. The frond isn't finished revealing its beauty once you've seen it from above. Its hidden face carries an entirely separate layer of organization, another quiet sign that these plants are built with far more subtlety than casual observers usually give them credit for. Those small spore clusters are called sori, and they vary beautifully from one species to the next. Once you know to look for them, they become one of the most satisfying details in the entire fern world. In one species, they might appear as neat, rounded dots spaced almost like careful punctuation. In another, they run along the veins or gather near the leaf margins in curved streaks. Their placement, color, and shape can be distinctive enough to function almost like a fingerprint. This is where fern beauty becomes wonderfully technical without losing any of its charm. The patterns obviously aren't there for us, and yet they often look composed enough to feel intentional. Under a hand lens, the undersides of fronds become little galleries of arrangement and variation. A person who once saw only generic green leaves begins to notice distinct designs, groupings, and recurring styles across different species. That shift matters. It turns the fern from a vague general impression into a series of true individuals, each carrying its own visual signature. The closer you look, the more these reproductive patterns start to feel like art quietly hidden in plain sight. Some ferns keep their spore clusters hidden beneath small protective flaps. In these species, the reproductive clusters are partly covered by a thin layer of tissue that acts almost like a tiny shield, while the structures beneath continue developing. This detail is easy to miss unless you look closely, but once seen, it adds an entirely new layer of complexity to the underside of the frond. Rather than exposed clusters sitting openly on the surface, you find coverings that lift, split, or curl back as the spores approach maturity. It's a subtle form of protection, and it suggests that even these tiny reproductive structures may need shielding from damage, drying, or disturbance at exactly the wrong moment. There's something appealingly secretive about this whole arrangement. The plant hasn't only tucked its future onto the hidden underside of the leaf, it's tucked that future beneath a second layer of protection as well. It feels almost like an added measure of privacy for anyone curious enough to look. That makes discovery all the more rewarding. You aren't just finding spore clusters, you're uncovering a concealed version of them, part hidden and part revealed, and all the more fascinating for it. Other species display their spore clusters completely openly, arranged in tidy rows or lines. Not every species bothers with any kind of protective covering. Some present their reproductive clusters directly on the leaf's underside, often arranged in striking patterns that follow the shape of the leaf itself. They might line the veins, trace the margins, or run in parallel bands that make the frond look marked with a kind of deliberate script. That openness has its own particular elegance. Nothing is tucked away or hidden. The structures are simply there, orderly and visible to anyone who thinks to flip the leaf over. This gives certain ferns a distinctly graphic clarity. Their hidden side isn't messy or accidental. It's organized with enough regularity to seem almost governed by rule. That visual order can be surprisingly memorable once you notice it. A person may eventually start recognizing certain species not by their outline seen from above, but by the pattern laid out beneath. In that sense, the open display becomes more than just a reproductive choice. It becomes part of the plant's character, a way of quietly writing identity onto the underside of its own leaves. A fern can genuinely be identified by the pattern hidden beneath its leaves, and that idea alone makes them feel more intriguing. Many people naturally expect identification to rely mainly on the obvious features, overall shape, size, color as seen from above. With ferns, the underside very often carries some of the most useful clues of all. The position of the spore clusters, whether or not they're covered, the way they align along veins or margins, and even the spacing between them, can be enough to separate one species from a very similar-looking neighbor. This turns identification into a kind of careful, deliberate reading. You aren't simply admiring the plant, you're decoding it. That process can be surprisingly absorbing because the answer may lie in details completely invisible until the frond is gently lifted and examined up close. It gives fern study a real intimacy that's easy to fall in love with. To truly know the plant, you have to look exactly where casual attention never goes. You have to inspect the hidden face, and there's something wonderful in that. The fern keeps part of its identity tucked out of plain sight, quietly waiting for an observer willing to notice what lies underneath. Fern hairs and scales can be just as diagnostic to a trained eye as flowers are in other plant groups. In many families, flowers do most of the work of recognition and comparison. Ferns often ask you to look elsewhere entirely. Along the stalks, at the base of each leaflet, and across the leaf surfaces, you might find fine hairs, bristles, or tiny scales, and their color, density, shape, and exact placement can help distinguish one closely related species from another. These structures can look almost insignificant at first, but to a careful eye, they're rich with information. A pale scale with a darker center, a delicate fringe of hairs along one edge, a stalk that's glossy and nearly bare. Each of these small details can point in a very different taxonomic direction. This is part of what makes fern observation feel so immersive. It trains your attention onto small, tactile things rather than bright, obvious signals, and the reward is that the plant slowly resolves into something closer to a personality. The details are minute, but they aren't trivial in the slightest. They're the exact clues by which the fern quietly declares itself. Someone who learns to notice them moves from seeing greenery in general terms to seeing a particular individual with a particular, unmistakable design. Some ferns feel genuinely fuzzy, because a covering of fine scales or hairs coats the frond. That softness can be far more important than it first appears. What seems like a pleasant texture may actually be part of how the plant manages water loss, filters excess light, or defends itself against abrasion and small grazing animals. Tiny scales or hairs can help reduce moisture loss, reflect harsh light, and provide a small measure of physical protection. They also completely change the visual character of the frond. Instead of a flat, uniformly green surface, you get something muted, velvety, or softly silvered, with light catching it in a gentler, more diffuse way. The whole plant begins to feel almost furred. In dry or exposed habitats, that coating can genuinely make the difference between real stress and quiet survival. In shaded, sheltered places, it can still give a species a distinct personality, one that's more tactile than purely visual. People often remember these particular ferns because the sensation in the hand confirms exactly what the eye already suspected. This isn't a smooth, polished leaf. It has genuine surface warmth and texture. The result is a fern that feels less like polished foliage and more like something woven or gently clothed. Others are smooth and glossy, almost like polished green leather. Here the effect is completely different. The frond catches light in broad, clean reflections, and the surface can look almost varnished right after rain. That gleaming finish gives certain species a bold presence, especially in deep shade, where glossy surfaces stand out sharply against the duller foliage surrounding them. These leaves can seem less delicately feathery and more distinctly sculpted, carrying a firmness that suggests endurance and quiet poise. In some cases, that texture reflects genuine adaptation, since thicker, smoother surfaces can help with both water balance and physical durability. But even before you think about the underlying function, the aesthetic effect is powerful. A glossy fern can look refined, deliberate, and almost luxurious. It's a reminder that fern beauty isn't limited to softness or intricate patterning. Some species impress purely through simplicity, sheen, and composure. In the right light, a cluster of such fronds can appear almost too perfect to be wild, as though each leaf had been hand-polished. That contrast keeps the whole group endlessly interesting from one species to the next. A fern frond can actually keep growing directly from its tip. Unlike many ordinary leaves, which reach a certain point and are essentially finished in shape, some fern fronds continue extending from their very apex as development proceeds. That gives them a very different rhythm of growth, one that feels more like an ongoing journey than a single sudden reveal. The growing tip stays active, adding length and opening new sections over time, so the leaf appears to advance forward continually into open space. In climbing or scrambling species, this can be especially dramatic. The frond isn't just expanding in place, it's actively reaching outward. That quality genuinely changes how the plant occupies its surroundings. Instead of sitting passively where it first unfurled, the frond can keep negotiating light, support, and available space as it continues to develop. There's something almost exploratory about it. A fern leaf becomes a moving front of growth rather than a fixed, finished panel. Once you understand that, certain fronds stop looking static entirely. They start to look like living lines still in progress, still writing themselves outward into the air, from the very tip onward. In some species, the fronds arch outward like a fountain. This particular growth form gives a plant immediate atmosphere. The fronds rise from a central crown, then curve outward and downward in a sweep that feels both balanced and abundant. The overall effect isn't flat, it's flowing, as if the plant were quietly pouring green out from its own center. In gardens, forests, or containers, that shape creates a real sense of motion, even when the surrounding air is completely still. It also changes how the plant uses the space around it. Rather than presenting a single flat face to the world, it spreads outward in every direction, softening edges and filling volume. That's part of why arching species feel so generous. They don't simply occupy a patch of ground. They create a real presence around themselves. Light filters through them differently, shadows gather beneath them differently, and even nearby surfaces seem to gain a kind of softness by association. It's one of the most graceful forms found anywhere in the plant world. A well-grown fountain-shaped fern doesn't just grow, it seems to unfurl into the room or landscape around it with real confidence and ease. In other species, the fronds rise stiffly upward, more like rigid green feathers. These species create a completely different impression altogether. Instead of spilling outward, their leaves stand upright, often arranged in tight ranks or clean vertical lines. The overall result can feel precise, formal, even faintly architectural. A clump of such fronds might resemble a fan of plumes or a gathering of green spears, softened just slightly at the edges. This upright posture changes the entire personality of the plant. It becomes less about flow and more about structure. In shaded ground or rocky terrain, that quality can be extremely effective. The plant catches the eye through its poise rather than through any sweeping gesture, and the repeated vertical lines can make even a small colony look ordered and deliberate. There's also something faintly bird-like about the overall silhouette, which may explain why feather comparisons come so naturally to mind. Yet unlike actual feathers, these fronds are durable, rooted, and alive with slow, ongoing growth. The effect is elegant in a completely different register, not soft abundance, but held, disciplined form. A fern becoming almost column-like without ever losing its essential delicacy. Fern forms across the world can look feathery, antler-shaped, arranged like the rungs of a ladder, or spread out like an open hand. By this point in our exploration, the simplest truth may be that there's no single fern silhouette at all. Some species divide into fine plumes so airy they seem ready to dissolve into shadow. Some branch out like antlers and feel almost sculptural. Others arrange their segments along a central stalk with the steady regularity of rungs on a ladder, while still others spread their leaflets into shapes that suggest fingers or an open palm. This range isn't some minor side detail. It's one of the central reasons the whole group stays so consistently compelling. The deeper you travel into it, the more the category itself keeps slipping away from any neat mental picture. Ferns aren't one design endlessly repeated across climates and centuries. They're an entire gallery of forms, all built on shared ancestry and endless creative variation. That's exactly what makes them so rewarding to keep following. Every time you think you've finally grasped the essence of a fern, another shape appears and quietly broadens the definition all over again. The result isn't confusion, it's genuine wonder. A single lineage has somehow learned how to look astonishingly different from itself, again and again. Ferns never developed seeds, and yet they conquered vast stretches of dry land remarkably early. It's easy to assume that seeds were always destined to be the winning innovation in plant evolution, and in many ways they were. But long before seeds came to dominate so much of the modern landscape, spore-bearing plants had already found powerful ways to spread across entire continents. Ferns belong to that older strategy. They relied on lightweight spores, an internal vascular system, and flexible life cycles to colonize damp ground, shaded slopes, riverbanks, and expanding early forests. They never needed flowers, cones, or fruit to become genuinely successful. What they needed instead was precise timing, reliable moisture, and enough patience to make the most of a world that was still, in a very real sense, becoming green for the first time. That's part of what makes them so quietly impressive. They were among the earliest true masters of terrestrial plant life, and they achieved it without relying on the reproductive system we now think of as the modern standard. In a sense, they helped prove that large, complex land-dwelling plants were possible long before seed plants ever rose to their eventual dominance. They represent an older botanical solution, and it worked astonishingly well. Their distant ancestors were part of Earth's very first great green worlds. Try to picture the planet before anything resembling familiar forests of oak, pine, or flowering trees existed at all. The continents were still being transformed by earlier forms of vegetation, and among the lineages contributing to that early greening were the ancient relatives of today's ferns. These were members of a much wider spore-bearing world that helped build some of the first truly expansive plant-covered landscapes anywhere on land. And that change wasn't merely visual. As vegetation spread, it altered soil composition, slowed erosion, influenced how water cycled through the landscape, and even changed the chemistry of the atmosphere itself. In other words, these early green worlds didn't just decorate the young planet, they help genuinely remake it. That's the scale at which fern ancestry becomes truly thrilling to think about. A single frond growing quietly beside a modern stream is linked, through an unbroken chain of deep evolutionary history, to one of the most important transformations Earth has ever experienced: the shift from bare, lifeless land into living, breathing terrain. Once you see that connection clearly, a fern stops looking like a humble shade plant. It becomes a surviving thread from the great botanical revolution that helped reshape the entire surface of the planet. Ancient fern relatives helped shape those coal-forming swamp ecosystems we touched on earlier. In the deep past, vast wetlands spread across parts of the ancient world, filled with towering vegetation, saturated ground, and thick, humid air. Among the dominant plants in these ecosystems were ancient relatives of today's ferns, alongside other spore-bearing groups that no longer exist in quite the same form. These swamps weren't just biologically rich, they were geologically consequential on an enormous scale. Plant matter accumulated in waterlogged conditions where full decay simply couldn't keep pace, and over immense stretches of time, that buried material was compressed and slowly transformed into coal. So whenever people talk about coal today, they're also, in part, talking about the remains of these vanished green worlds. That link gives fern history a startling reach directly into human civilization. Entire industrial eras were quite literally powered by sunlight that had been captured and stored by ancient swamp vegetation hundreds of millions of years earlier. The same lineage standing quietly in today's woodland shade is connected, through deep time, to ecosystems that left behind entire fuel beds buried in the earth. Fern history isn't only botanical. In a strange and very real sense, it helped write part of civilization's energy story. Today's fern diversity is old in its origins, yet surprisingly modern in how it spread. That combination is one of the most intriguing things about the entire group. On one hand, it carries deep evolutionary roots stretching far back into the earliest history of land plants. On the other, many of the ferns we recognize today belong to lineages that spread and diversified strongly in worlds that already looked far more recognizably modern. They are ancient, certainly, but they are not frozen relics. They kept adapting, kept radiating outward into new niches, and kept finding fresh opportunities long after many of the earlier plant communities around them had already changed beyond recognition. This gives them a character that feels less like leftovers from a vanished age and more like active, ongoing participants in Earth's continuing ecological story. Their origins are old enough to inspire real awe, and yet their success carried forward into landscapes shared with flowering plants, modern forests, and shifting climates. That combination of old ancestry and continual reinvention gives the whole group an unusual kind of energy. Ferns aren't simply survivors that managed to endure. They're survivors that kept actively evolving, which is exactly why they remain so widespread, so varied, and so thoroughly alive in the present moment. Some fern groups vanished long ago, leaving nothing behind but fossils. The fern story isn't one smooth, unbroken line running from past to present. It's full of branches, and some of those branches came to an end entirely. Whole groups that once contributed meaningfully to ancient landscapes are now known only from impressions left in stone, compressed plant remains, or mineralized fragments preserved across geological time. Their overall shapes can be reconstructed, their likely habitats inferred, and their place within the broader history of plant evolution carefully considered. But the living organisms themselves are simply gone. That gives these fossil fern relatives a certain quiet poignancy. They remind us that survival was never guaranteed, even for lineages that once seemed thoroughly established. The world changed, climates shifted, new competitors rose to prominence, and some forms simply never made the crossing into the present. When paleobotanists study these lost groups, they aren't just naming extinct plants. They're recovering fragments of an entire vanished green world. Every fossilized frond or stem becomes a message from a botanical branch that once lived fully and completely, and then disappeared, leaving only stone to carry its memory forward. Others made it through repeated mass extinctions and still survive to this day, and that's where fern history begins to feel genuinely defiant. Across geological time, Earth has endured catastrophic episodes that transformed life on a truly global scale. Oceans shifted, climates lurched violently, ecosystems collapsed outright, and countless lineages disappeared forever. And yet, some fern lineages made it through. Not unchanged, certainly, but alive. They passed through crises that erased many of their contemporaries entirely and continued forward into new, unfamiliar worlds. There's something deeply compelling about that particular kind of endurance. A modern fern isn't simply old in terms of ancestry. It belongs to a group tested repeatedly by upheaval on a planetary scale. That gives even the humblest frond a kind of hidden drama. Its lineage has endured stress beyond almost any human frame of reference, and the plant's calm, understated appearance can conceal that epic resilience completely. To stand before one today is, in a sense, to stand before the descendant of true survivors, a green continuation of life that kept going even as entire worlds were falling apart around it. Very few ordinary garden or woodland plants carry that kind of deep historical toughness quite so quietly. Ferns very often surge in numbers after ecological disasters open up the landscape. When catastrophe strips vegetation away entirely, the first chapters of recovery don't always belong to large, slow-growing trees. Very often, the early advantage goes instead to organisms that can disperse quickly, arrive in overwhelming numbers, and tolerate genuinely unstable ground. Ferns are especially good at exactly this. Their spores travel widely, their life cycles are built to exploit newly opened space, and certain species are particularly well suited to the chaotic conditions left behind after fire, ashfall, flooding, or other major forms of disruption. That means a devastated landscape may not stay barren for very long at all. Ferns can be among the very first signs that life is beginning to reclaim it. In that sense, they function as plants of return. They don't just endure quietly within established mature forests. They can appear right when those forests are broken open, stepping into the vacancy long before slower, more established competitors regain control. There's something genuinely powerful in that role. Ferns become not merely survivors of disaster, but active agents of recovery, arriving early to begin the long, patient work of turning damage back into green. Paleobotanists sometimes find striking moments preserved in the rock record known as fern spikes. This phrase refers to layers where fern spores suddenly become far more abundant than usual, and that surge matters because it can mark a genuinely dramatic ecological moment, a time when a landscape had been disturbed so severely that ferns briefly gained a major advantage in the aftermath. Instead of trees and complex forest vegetation dominating the pollen and spore record, you see instead a sudden flush of fern evidence rising up through the sediment, almost like a signal flare sent up from deep time. It's one of the more elegant ideas in the whole field of paleobotany, the notion that disaster can leave behind a distinctly green fingerprint. These spikes aren't only about fern success in isolation, they're clues pointing toward wider collapse and eventual recovery. A thin band of ancient rock can preserve the memory of real devastation, followed swiftly by the return of spore-bearing plants ready to occupy freshly opened ground. Few details make the fern story feel more dramatic than this. Recorded in stone, across spans of millions of years, they can appear as the very first wave of life returning after ecological shock. Those fern spikes signal rapid recovery following major devastation, and the real beauty of the idea is how it transforms a simple patch of ancient spores in rock into an entire story of resilience. After some catastrophic event strips ecosystems back to bare ground, whether the cause was volcanic, climatic, or something else entirely, the fossil record may reveal a sudden abundance of fern spores. That doesn't mean the world healed instantly. It means the earliest stage of healing had genuinely begun. Ferns were among the quick returners, the first flush of green cover in places where larger vegetation had been completely stripped away. Their appearance can suggest bare ground slowly becoming reoccupied, ash or raw sediment beginning to soften under living growth, and the very first rebuilding of ecological structure after collapse. In other words, a fern spike isn't merely evidence of a temporary abundance, it's evidence of momentum, specifically in the direction of renewed life. That's exactly why it feels so moving, even discussed in strictly scientific terms. Deep in the rock record, these plants can represent the first genuine answer to ruin. Not the final mature forest, and not the full recovery, but the very first real step back toward a living landscape. Taken together, their fossil record, their reproductive strategy, and their ongoing ecological behavior all point toward a remarkable recurring pattern. Again and again, whenever disturbance clears space on a large scale, these plants are perfectly positioned to return. They arrive through drifting spores, exploit exposed ground quickly, and begin building fresh green cover in places where earlier plant communities have been completely broken apart. This role stretches all the way from modern burned hillsides and landslides to ancient crises recorded permanently in stone. It gives ferns a genuine kind of historical identity. They aren't only plants of shade and stillness, they're also unmistakably plants of restart. That contrast is part of their quiet power. The very same frond that looks perfectly calm beside a stream belongs to a lineage closely associated with renewal after upheaval. It's almost as though ferns carry a deep memory of damaged worlds and know instinctively how to answer them. That might be one reason they feel so quietly evocative. Their story isn't simply one of persistence through time. It's one of reappearance, recovery, and the repeated greening of emptied ground. Some ferns can tolerate astonishingly dry conditions, at least for a while, and that surprises many people because the group is so often associated with damp forests and shaded ravines. Yet not all ferns are creatures of constant moisture. Certain species can endure genuine periods of serious drying by slowing their internal activity, reducing water loss, and simply waiting out conditions that would seem hostile to such delicate-looking plants. They may curl, stiffen, or appear completely lifeless for a time, but their tissues remain poised for recovery the moment moisture eventually returns. This ability doesn't turn them into desert cacti, of course, but it does reveal a hidden toughness beneath the frond's refined, delicate appearance. A plant that looks perfectly at home in constant mist can, in certain species, persist through real, sustained hardship. That reversal is one reason ferns stay so consistently fascinating. They keep gently undermining the assumptions people tend to make about them. Soft doesn't always mean fragile. Green doesn't always mean constantly wet. In exposed, rocky habitats or seasonally dry environments, some ferns prove that an ancient lineage can be far more resilient, more strategic, and more patient than it initially appears. Certain species, sometimes called resurrection ferns, can shrivel almost completely during drought and then green again almost overnight after rain. Very few plant tricks feel more genuinely dramatic than this one. During prolonged dryness, their fronds curl, fade, and take on the appearance of something already dead. To an untrained eye, the plant may seem entirely gone, no longer part of the living landscape at all. Then rain finally arrives, or humidity rises enough, and the transformation begins almost immediately. Water returns to the tissues, the fronds slowly uncurl, their color deepens, and the plant resumes visible life with startling speed. The effect can feel almost theatrical, as though time itself has quietly been reversed. This isn't magic, of course, but a remarkable physiological strategy that allows the plant to survive a level of desiccation that would ruin most less prepared species. It genuinely changes how you think about botanical life. Simple dormancy is one thing. Apparent death, followed by a visible rapid return, is something else entirely. The plant becomes a lesson in suspended vitality, waiting patiently through inhospitable conditions, then re-entering the world just as green as before, making drought look less like an ending and more like a temporary pause. A small number of ferns even thrive on serpentine soils, ground rich in unusually harsh minerals that most plants find deeply inhospitable. Serpentine terrain is a genuinely difficult environment for the vast majority of plant life. These soils often carry unusual chemistry, with elevated levels of certain metals and a nutrient balance that can be seriously challenging for ordinary vegetation. Growth there tends to be sparse, stunted, or highly specialized. And yet some ferns have found ways to cope, occupying niches where many potential competitors simply struggle, effectively turning inhospitable ground into genuinely viable habitat. That ability is fascinating because it shows just how chemically selective plant life can actually be. The earth beneath our feet isn't uniform, and certain species are tuned to conditions that would stress or even poison others entirely. For ferns, this expands the whole story well beyond the usual damp woodland romance. Here they become genuine specialists of difficult geology, living in places where the local chemistry itself acts almost like a filter. On serpentine slopes, a fern isn't simply surviving in a pretty landscape. It's actively negotiating unusual metals, a skewed nutrient balance, and real physiological stress, and winning just enough ground to make a living where most plants would rather not even try. Some species strongly prefer limestone, while close relatives avoid it completely. Beneath a fern's outward elegance lies a surprisingly exact relationship with local rock chemistry. Limestone creates alkaline conditions, affects how water drains through the soil, and shapes which minerals are actually available to a plant's roots. For some ferns, that combination is exactly ideal. They cling to limestone cliffs, colonize old mortar and stone walls, and flourish in crevices where limestone quietly governs the local environment. For others, those very same conditions form a real barrier. These species are instead adapted to more acidic ground and simply don't perform well anywhere lime is abundant. This means underlying geology can shape entire fern communities in ways most casual observers never notice at all. A wall, a ravine, or a hillside might look green in a broad general sense, but the type of rock lying underneath quietly decides exactly who gets to live there. That hidden relationship gives ferns a kind of deep geological intimacy. They're reading the stone itself as much as they're reading the available light. Once you know that, a fern growing out of a ruin or a cliff face becomes far more than a picturesque detail. It becomes tangible evidence of a long, quiet conversation between plant and rock. Fern roots can also help stabilize unstable slopes after major disturbance. Following a landslide, a serious erosion event, or any other significant disruption, loose ground can remain vulnerable for a very long time. Rain can continue stripping soil away, and small collapses can keep occurring before the surface finally stabilizes. In places like this, any plant capable of quickly establishing a hold becomes especially important. Ferns often play a genuine part in this process because their roots and underground stems help bind together the upper layers of soil, litter, and debris. They aren't performing engineering miracles entirely on their own, but they can contribute meaningfully to the first real stages of slope recovery. That role gives them a practical, almost heroic quality. They aren't simply returning because the conditions happen to suit them. Their return can genuinely help make the ground more livable for whatever comes next. A fragile hillside slowly starts to hold together. Loose particles stay put. Moisture is retained just a little more effectively. Over time, that matters enormously. The fern becomes a genuine part of the process by which raw disturbance gradually turns back into stable, functioning habitat, one rooted patch at a time. Inside forests, dense fern growth can visibly slow the impact of falling rain on bare soil. A heavy shower hitting exposed ground directly can be surprisingly destructive. It breaks apart soil structure, splashes loose particles free, and encourages runoff that carries valuable fertility straight downhill. Ferns help interrupt that force. Their fronds catch rainfall as it descends, soften its impact, and spread the resulting drip out gradually over time, instead of allowing every drop to strike the ground with its full, undiminished force. In dense patches, this creates a kind of living buffer between cloud and earth. The effect might sound modest, but across a whole forest floor, it can be genuinely significant. Soil stays better protected, splash erosion is reduced, and the ground underneath remains more stable through repeated storms. This is exactly the kind of quiet ecological service that often goes completely unnoticed, simply because nothing dramatic ever seems to happen. The forest simply holds together a little better, because a layer of ferns happens to be in place. That gives ferns a hidden role in maintaining the overall texture of woodland ground, not merely as plants growing on the surface, but as genuine moderators of the rain itself. Their fronds can also shelter insects, frogs, and countless other small forms of forest life. A fern patch is rarely ever just a fern patch. Between the stems, beneath the arching fronds, and in the cool, consistently damp air surrounding them, there's very often a small hidden world of animals making use of that cover. Insects rest there, hunt there, and hide from predators there. Tiny frogs may use the moisture and concealment as protection during the most vulnerable parts of their lives. Spiders build webs among the stems. Small invertebrates move quietly through the litter caught below. What looks, from a distance, like a simple mass of greenery can become, at close range, a genuinely layered shelter system. That's one reason dense fern growth feels so alive, even when nothing obvious appears to be moving. The structure of the plant creates countless microhabitats, and other organisms simply move in. This makes the fern important, not just as an individual species, but as a kind of living architecture within the forest, one that changes the local microclimate near the ground and offers room for lives much smaller than our own to unfold in relative safety. Dense fern thickets can also shape exactly where tree seedlings succeed beneath the canopy. Not every patch of forest floor offers a young tree the same chance at survival. Light levels are uneven, moisture shifts from spot to spot, and the vegetation already present can either protect or actively hinder a seedling trying to establish itself. Fern thickets play a genuinely important role in that balance. In some cases, they help by softening the force of falling rain, reducing temperature extremes near the ground, and creating a more buffered, sheltered environment. In other cases, they compete so effectively for available light and space that tree seedlings struggle to get started at all. This means ferns can meaningfully influence how a forest regenerates over time, not simply by existing within it, but by actively shaping the opportunities available to the very next generation of woody plants. That ecological leverage is fascinating, because it makes the fern far more than background greenery. It becomes part of the decision-making environment of the forest itself, even without any real intention behind it. A dense stand of fronds may quietly determine which young plants live, which ones fail, and how the future canopy eventually begins to take shape above them. Some animals use fern cover directly as nurseries and hiding places. For a small creature, open ground can be genuinely dangerous. Exposure means heat, dryness, and visibility to predators. Fern cover changes that instantly. A low arch of fronds creates shade, humidity, and concealment close to the ground, which can make it a genuinely valuable nursery zone for eggs, for young animals, or for species that simply need protection while resting or hunting. Small reptiles may slip beneath it. Amphibians may use it to avoid drying out entirely. In some places, nesting or roosting behavior can also be shaped by the cover and privacy these plants naturally provide. What's striking is exactly how much safety a fern can generate simply through its physical form. It doesn't need thorns, toxins, or massive size to matter. It only needs structure. And for animals living at a small scale, that structure can genuinely mean the difference between danger and survival. Once you think about it this way, a fern patch begins to look far less like scenery and far more like a piece of shelter infrastructure, a green refuge where vulnerable lives can stay hidden just long enough to grow. Fallen fern litter also quietly feeds the ongoing chemistry of the forest floor. When aging fronds finally collapse and join the layer of debris beneath the living plants, they don't stop mattering in the slightest. Their remains enter the slow chemical economy of the forest, where fungi, microbes, moisture, and simple time begin the long work of breaking them down. Nutrients are gradually released, organic matter accumulates, soil structure shifts, and the ground itself becomes a little richer and more complex, because yesterday's fronds are quietly being transformed into tomorrow's growing substrate. This isn't flashy science, but it's genuinely essential. Forests run on exactly these kinds of quiet, ongoing exchanges. Every fallen piece of plant tissue becomes part of the larger cycle of decay and renewal, and fern litter contributes its own steady share to that ongoing work. In consistently damp woodland conditions, the process can be especially intimate, with decomposition happening directly beneath the same living fronds that will eventually benefit from the altered, enriched soil forming above the old remains. That closed loop gives the fern a satisfying sense of completeness. It grows up from the forest floor, shapes that floor while it's alive, and then continues shaping it after falling back down into it once again. Human beings have admired ferns so intensely across history that it eventually sparked what people came to call fern fever. There aren't many plant groups that have inspired something close to genuine obsession, and yet ferns managed exactly that. People didn't simply notice them and move on. They collected them, studied them, drew them, pressed them into albums, displayed them proudly, and spoke about them with a kind of fascination usually reserved for rare animals or distant ruins. Part of the appeal was purely visual. Their shapes felt elegant without being obvious, ancient without seeming lifeless, and wild without needing any flowers at all to attract attention. But there was more to it than simple beauty. Ferns carried a genuine sense of mystery. They reproduced in ways most people didn't fully understand at the time. They appeared in cool, hidden places, and they seemed to belong to some older, half-forgotten world. That combination made them nearly irresistible. Once people began looking closely, admiration quickly became appetite. A walk through the countryside turned into an active search. A single plant spotted growing from a wall became a genuine treasure. Ferns weren't simply liked. They were pursued with real passion, which says a great deal about their strange, lasting pull on the human imagination. During the 19th century, one particular country developed a remarkable, widespread enthusiasm for these plants, and what began as pure botanical interest soon became a genuine social craze. Ordinary country walks turned into dedicated fern hunts. Expanding railway networks made remote habitats far easier to reach, meaning enthusiasts could travel greater distances in search of unusual species. People scrambled over rocks, explored steep ravines, and searched damp cliff faces with an intensity that sounds almost competitive by modern standards. Collecting wasn't limited to professional botanists either. Amateurs, entire families, and casual hobbyists all joined in, often learning names, growth habits, and preferred habitats with genuinely impressive seriousness. A particularly rare specimen could become the prize of an entire local expedition. Ferns worked their way into homes, gardens, personal albums, and everyday conversation. They became part science, part fashion, and part genuine adventure. That's what makes the whole period so fascinating in hindsight. A society known primarily for industry and expansion became, for a time, thoroughly captivated by shaded gullies and curled green leaves. Ferns turned into genuine objects of quest, and collecting them became a way of combining curiosity, social standing, and a real sense of romance with the surrounding countryside. This particular craze even earned its own dedicated name, one that quite literally translates to fern madness, and it changed both garden design and interior style. The word itself is unforgettable, and it captures exactly how far the enthusiasm managed to spread. This wasn't some narrow botanical fad confined to a handful of specialist circles. It genuinely influenced how people imagined beauty, both indoors and out. Garden designers began deliberately creating spaces suited to ferns. Shaded rockeries, humid corners, carefully sheltered arrangements built specifically to show off their forms. Public parks and private estates alike embraced them enthusiastically. Indoor cultivation expanded as well, which in turn encouraged entirely new types of display furniture and decorative glass plant cases. The craze also reshaped broader taste. Fern shapes became symbols of refinement, of nature, and of cultivated curiosity. Their outlines suggested delicacy and depth without ever feeling gaudy, which made them perfectly suited to the sensibilities of the age. That's exactly why the whole episode matters so much in hindsight. It proves that ferns weren't simply collected as dry scientific specimens. They actively reshaped how people decorated their homes, designed their gardens, and thought about the relationship between everyday domestic life and the wider natural world just beyond the door. Fern motifs eventually spread across wallpaper, pottery, ironwork, and jewelry. Once the fern craze fully took hold, the plant effectively escaped the garden and moved directly into design. Its curling forms and finely divided fronds translated beautifully into decorative pattern, and before long those shapes appeared almost everywhere you looked. Wallpaper carried repeating fern silhouettes across entire walls. Pottery was pressed or hand-painted with fronds. Ironwork borrowed their curving, branching lines for gates, railings, and household fixtures. Jewelry adopted fern motifs that made the plant seem simultaneously delicate, refined, and thoroughly fashionable. This spread revealed something genuinely important about human taste. Ferns offered a way to bring nature indoors without relying on bright flowers or loud, saturated color. Their forms felt controlled, intricate, and elegant. They were wild, but never messy, ancient, but never severe. That made them ideal for ornament of every kind. A person could admire the plant growing wild in a ravine one afternoon, then return home and find its exact image echoed in the drawing room that same evening. The fern became more than a living organism at that point. It became an entire visual language for style, taste, and cultivated wonder. Before the age of modern climate control, people even built special glass cases specifically to grow ferns indoors. Domestic air in many homes tended to be smoky, dry, and unstable, which made life genuinely difficult for moisture-loving woodland species. The solution people arrived at was remarkably clever. They began using sealed glass enclosures, often known by a particular historical name, to create protected miniature environments where humidity stayed consistently high and conditions remained far more stable than the room outside. Inside these enclosed little worlds, ferns could thrive in a way they almost never would sitting on an ordinary windowsill. The cases also turned indoor gardening into a genuine form of theater. A carefully arranged interior of moss, stones, and fronds became a living scene displayed under glass, part scientific curiosity, part decorative showpiece. To own one of these cases was to bring a controlled fragment of the damp outdoors directly into the home. There's something wonderfully revealing in that level of effort. Fern admiration didn't stop at simple collecting or illustration. People were genuinely willing to redesign their own domestic environment purely to keep these ancient plants comfortably alive indoors. Those early glass cases went on to help inspire what we now think of as the modern terrarium. The basic principle behind today's version has clear roots in those earlier glass plant cases, and it still feels a little magical even now. Create a sealed space, place plants and growing medium inside, and the system begins cycling its own moisture almost automatically. Water evaporates, condenses on the glass, and returns to the soil below. Humidity stays consistently elevated, and certain plants thrive in the resulting stability. Ferns were perfect for demonstrating the beauty of this idea because they look especially at home inside small, humid miniature worlds. Their fronds soften the hard edges of stones and make even a small container feel genuinely lush and complete. This historical link matters because it shows that the terrarium isn't merely a modern trend invented from nothing. It descends directly from a genuine botanical solution to a real cultivation problem, one shaped in part by a deep human desire to keep fern-rich micro-landscapes close at hand. Every glass garden built today carries a small trace of that older fascination. In many ways, the modern terrarium is a small living descendant of the era when people built entire worlds under glass purely for the sake of ferns. Ferns remain beloved houseplants today largely because they soften rooms so effortlessly. A fern changes an interior space in a way remarkably few plants can manage. It doesn't rely on dramatic flowers, bold color, or hard geometric lines. Instead, it introduces movement, texture, and a particular kind of visual gentleness that makes a room feel more genuinely inhabited and less rigid. Fronds blur hard edges. They spill, arch, and feather softly through the air. They make surrounding furniture seem a little less severe, and empty corners feel a little less bare. That's part of why people keep coming back to them indoors again and again. A single well-placed plant can make a shelf, a table, or a hanging pot feel noticeably more alive. There's also something quietly timeless about their presence. They seem simultaneously old-fashioned and completely current, equally at home in a Victorian sitting room and a thoroughly modern apartment. But their appeal isn't purely aesthetic. They invite attention without ever shouting for it. A room with a fern in it tends to feel calmer, greener, and more grounded. These plants don't dominate an interior. They gently alter its mood, which may be exactly why people keep falling for them, generation after generation. And yet many wild ferns are far harder to please than their houseplant cousins might suggest. This is where the romance of fern growing tends to meet reality head-on. A species that looks perfectly serene in a wild ravine may actually depend on a very specific combination of shade, moisture, air movement, soil chemistry, and seasonal rhythm. A combination that's genuinely difficult to recreate anywhere else. Some species need constant humidity without any stagnant air. Some want consistently cool roots and nearby moving water. Others are tied to very specific rock types or narrow woodland conditions that simply can't be copied with a pot and good intentions alone. That's exactly why certain wild species resist cultivation so stubbornly. They aren't being difficult in any human sense. They're simply adapted to precise, unforgiving circumstances. And this precision makes them more interesting rather than less. It means every fern isn't just a decorative shape, but a genuine habitat specialist, carrying the exact signature of a real place. To fail with one in cultivation is very often to discover exactly how exact its needs truly are. The lesson is a humbling one. Ferns may look broadly adaptable at a glance, but many of them belong to worlds so specific that an ordinary home simply can't imitate them. Some ferns are genuinely edible, but correct identification matters enormously. This is one of those facts that sounds charming at first, and turns quite serious almost immediately after. Yes, certain species have long been eaten by people, particularly when young and carefully prepared. But the fern world isn't a buffet where anything green and curled is automatically fair game. Different species contain very different compounds, and confusion between them can genuinely be risky. That makes correct identification essential rather than optional. What fascinates me here is the contrast between familiarity and real uncertainty. A spring woodland might be full of freshly emerging coils, all of them beautiful, all of them superficially suggestive of food to an untrained eye, and yet only some of them actually belong in a kitchen. This turns edible ferns into a subject shaped as much by cultural knowledge as by pure botany. People who use them safely aren't guessing. They're drawing on tradition, local understanding, and careful practiced recognition. The plant becomes a genuine test of attention. Beauty alone simply isn't enough. To eat it responsibly, you have to know exactly what you're looking at, and in the fern world, that knowledge truly matters. The young coiled shoots of certain species are eaten in some regions during a brief spring window. For a short stretch of time each year, before particular fronds fully unfurl, the young coiled shoots of specific species are gathered as a genuine seasonal food. This timing matters enormously, because the stage is fleeting. Wait too long, and the coils open, toughen, and become unsuitable for eating. Arrive at exactly the right moment, however, and you find one of spring's more unusual harvests. A food shaped like a spiral, tied directly to an ancient pattern of botanical growth. In places where this tradition is well established, the short season can carry real anticipation. These shoots aren't just ingredients. They're signals that the year is turning, and that fresh green abundance is beginning to return in earnest. That gives them a cultural life stretching well beyond simple flavor. They become part of local rhythm and memory. I find that connection between ancient plant form and seasonal human practice genuinely lovely. The same curl geometry that protects a young frond in the forest can also mark a brief culinary season, one that appears, peaks, and vanishes very quickly each year. Not every young shoot is safe to eat, which makes casual fern foraging genuinely risky. This is exactly where excitement has to yield to real caution. To an inexperienced forager, many young fern shoots can look tantalizingly similar to one another. They're curled, fresh, and seasonal, and that superficial resemblance creates real danger. Some species simply aren't suitable to eat at all. Others raise legitimate concerns because of the specific compounds they contain, or because preparation and precise species identification matter so much to safety. The risk doesn't come from the basic idea of fern eating itself. It comes from confidence without real knowledge. That makes fern foraging a genuinely poor place for casual guessing. It isn't like picking an obvious ripe apple off a familiar tree. It demands real precision, regional understanding, and a healthy respect for the fact that beauty and edibility don't always travel together in nature. In a strange way, this makes the whole subject even more compelling. A young curled shoot looks simple, even innocent, and yet it sits directly at the intersection of botany, culture, chemistry, and caution. The lesson is clear, and genuinely worth remembering. A curled green shoot isn't a meal until you truly know exactly whose shoot it is. Some ferns contain chemical compounds capable of harming grazing animals. Not every fern is simply passive greenery waiting quietly to be eaten. Some carry compounds that can make them genuinely problematic, even dangerous for livestock when consumed in significant quantity. This matters especially in places where animals graze across rough terrain, or where more desirable forage happens to be scarce. What seems like harmless vegetation along a field edge or woodland margin can become part of a genuine agricultural management concern. The underlying chemistry here is a useful reminder that plants aren't purely passive participants in their ecosystems. They're active players in a much larger ecological conflict. They aren't simply sitting there waiting to be consumed. Many defend themselves with compounds that reduce their own palatability, interfere with digestion, or cause outright harm to would-be grazers. Ferns are part of that larger botanical reality. I find this genuinely fascinating because it pushes back against their generally gentle reputation. A frond may look entirely soft and harmless, and yet inside it may carry a chemical strategy shaped by long stretches of evolutionary pressure. That hidden edge gives the whole group real depth. Ferns aren't only ancient and elegant, some of them are quietly chemically armed in ways grazing animals genuinely need to avoid. Others have long, well-documented histories in traditional medicine. Across many different cultures, certain ferns have been gathered, prepared, and used for healing purposes, often in ways closely tied to local knowledge and inherited practice, passed down across generations. This doesn't mean every traditional use has been fully validated by modern scientific research. And it certainly doesn't mean every medicinal fern is automatically safe without proper expertise. What it does clearly show is that people have paid close, sustained attention to these plants for a very long time, not simply as ornament or curiosity, but as potential allies in matters of genuine health. That completely changes the emotional register of the fern. It becomes far more than a quiet woodland presence. It becomes part of human care, belief, and careful experimentation carried across countless generations. The frond growing quietly beside a stream is suddenly connected to kitchens, remedies, field knowledge, and long personal memory. There's something deeply human in that continuity. A plant studied today under laboratory conditions may once have been known primarily through hands, habit, and inherited trust. Ferns have lived not only within ecosystems but within human traditions as well, which makes their overall story both botanical and cultural at the very same time. The fibrous material from certain tree fern trunks has also found real use in horticulture. In some parts of the world, this fibrous material has been genuinely valued because it holds moisture well, drains effectively, and provides a useful physical structure for growing other plants entirely. Orchid cultivation, in particular, became closely associated with tree fern fiber for many years, since many orchids naturally appreciate the airy, consistently damp support it can provide. This is a fascinating twist in the broader fern story. One fern effectively becomes the growing medium for an entirely different, equally treasured type of plant. Yet there's also a real shadow attached to that usefulness, because harvesting natural tree fern material can place genuine pressure on slow-growing species and the fragile habitats they depend on. So the tale ends up being both practical and cautionary at once. It shows just how deeply people have woven ferns into horticultural craft, while also serving as a reminder that botanical enthusiasm can carry real ecological costs of its own. The material was admired precisely because it worked so well, a success that reveals the genuinely remarkable physical qualities of tree fern structure and eventually the conservation questions that success went on to raise. In gardens, ferns can create real lushness without a single flashy bloom. That may be one of their greatest gifts to anyone designing outdoor space. A garden doesn't need bright petals to feel rich, layered, and thoroughly alive. Ferns prove that texture, form, and repetition can generate genuine beauty entirely on their own. A bed filled with them can look wonderfully abundant purely through contrast. Between broad and fine fronds, between upright and arching growth habits, between matte and glossy surfaces, the eye moves through the planting in a completely different way. Instead of darting from one flower to the next, it settles into overall shape and rhythm. This creates a more immersive, quieter kind of richness, built purely from green itself. It's a subtler pleasure, certainly, but very often a deeper one. Ferns make a place feel established, cool, and full, even when almost nothing nearby happens to be blooming. That quiet power is exactly why gardeners return to them so often when they want genuine atmosphere, rather than momentary spectacle. A fern border doesn't shout for attention. It envelops the space around it. It turns a shaded patch into something layered and genuinely inviting, and it manages this without ever asking a single flower for help. Shade gardening would feel far poorer without them. There are certainly other beautiful shade-tolerant plants, but very few feel as essential to the overall mood of a shaded garden as ferns do. They bridge the space between hostas, woodland flowers, moss, stone, and tree trunks with an ease that feels almost inevitable. Without them, shady areas can quickly become heavy, flat, or overly static. Ferns bring genuine lift, movement, and delicacy instead. They keep darkness from ever becoming dull. Their fronds catch small shifts of passing light, respond visibly to a light breeze, and create layers that make even the quietest corner feel genuinely inhabited. This is exactly why they matter so much in thoughtful garden design. They aren't merely convenient filler for difficult spots. They're among the plants that genuinely define what a beautiful shade garden can become. Remove them from the picture, and something vital goes noticeably missing. The space loses a certain softness and sense of age. It becomes less like a woodland and more static, less atmospheric, less quietly alive in motion. Ferns give shade its own language. They translate dim light into texture and form, and once you understand that, it becomes genuinely hard to imagine those spaces without them. Ferns manage to pair age, elegance, and strangeness within a single plant group, and very few other plant families combine these particular qualities quite so completely. They're ancient enough to carry deep time embedded directly in their lineage, elegant enough to soften an entire room or woodland edge with effortless grace, and strange enough to keep surprising you the moment you look past the surface. They have hidden generations, spore patterns tucked beneath their leaves, growth forms ranging from delicate lace to bold antlers, and histories tied to extinction, recovery, and genuine human obsession all at once. That particular mix is exactly why they're so captivating. If they were only old, they might feel remote and inaccessible. If they were only beautiful, they might feel merely decorative. If they were only strange, they might feel niche and obscure. But together, these qualities create something richer than any single trait could manage alone. Ferns feel simultaneously timeless and slightly uncanny. They seem to belong fully to the present moment, while still carrying a quiet whisper of another world entirely. That combination is genuinely rare, and it's exactly why people keep returning to them again and again. They satisfy curiosity, aesthetics, and a sense of wonder, all at the very same time. Botanists still actively debate the relationships within some of the more difficult fern lineages. For all their age and familiarity, ferns remain a genuinely unsolved puzzle in several respects. Some groups stay difficult to sort out precisely because outward appearance alone can be misleading. Older classifications don't always match newer genetic evidence, and different lines of research can complicate the overall family picture considerably. Genetic studies have clarified a great deal, but they've also revealed that some long-assumed relationships are far less straightforward than anyone originally expected. In certain lineages, species that look strikingly alike may not actually be especially close relatives, while others that seem quite different on the surface may prove more closely related than anyone had guessed. This makes fern systematics feel genuinely like detective work. Every new study carries the potential to reorganize parts of the accepted family tree. I find that ongoing uncertainty wonderful, honestly, because it keeps the whole subject genuinely alive. These aren't museum pieces locked into some final, complete understanding. They're active scientific questions still being worked out. A plant that looks perfectly modest out in the field may actually sit within an unresolved branch of evolutionary history, quietly waiting for new data to refine its exact story. Ferns remain ancient in origin, but their classification is still very much unfolding. Hybridization is common enough within this group to make fern family trees genuinely tangled. In many organism groups, hybridization happens occasionally and causes only minor confusion. In ferns, it can be significant enough to blur species boundaries in a far more persistent, lasting way. Different species may cross with one another, producing offspring that carry traits from both parent plants. Some of these hybrids turn out to be sterile. Others take part in more complex evolutionary patterns that eventually lead to entirely new stable lineages over time. The result is a genealogy that can become genuinely gloriously messy. A fern that looks intermediate between two known species may truly be exactly that. A group that appears neatly divided at first glance may actually be hiding past crossing events within its history. This is one reason classification can be so genuinely challenging in this particular plant family. The family tree isn't always a clean, simple branching diagram. Sometimes it develops braided, tangled sections that force botanists to think far more carefully about what species and relationships really mean in practice. For anyone simply enjoying the subject, this should make ferns feel even more interesting rather than less. Their history isn't only ancient, it's dynamically entangled. These plants don't always separate cleanly from one another. Sometimes they meet, mix, and quietly reshape their own story in the process. Some ferns can even reproduce without the usual step of fertilization at all. This is one of the most genuinely startling ways ferns manage to challenge our basic expectations. In certain species or specific populations, an entirely new spore-producing plant can arise without the standard union of egg and sperm that most people would assume is absolutely necessary somewhere in the life cycle. This alternative process allows the next generation to develop directly from the small, hidden gametophyte stage under the right conditions, entirely bypassing the usual sexual step. That's genuinely extraordinary, because it gives the plant an alternate route forward whenever circumstances don't favor the ordinary reproductive sequence. It's almost as though the fern has discovered its own biological shortcut, one that bypasses a step most of us would assume is simply unavoidable. This doesn't render sexual reproduction irrelevant within the group as a whole, but it does reveal exactly how flexible fern life cycles can genuinely be, and that flexibility is thrilling in its own right. The deeper you travel into fern biology, the less rigid the whole system actually seems. Even the most basic rules governing how a new generation begins can turn out to be far more inventive than anyone might initially expect. Whole genome duplication has helped many fern lineages diversify in genuinely surprising ways. In many ferns, evolution hasn't always advanced purely through small, incremental changes. Sometimes entire sets of chromosomes have duplicated outright, leaving plants with substantially more genetic material to work with going forward. That might sound abstract on its own, but the practical effect can be profound. A lineage can suddenly carry far more raw material for future variation, more room for traits to shift and adapt, and more ways to remain genuinely distinct from close relatives nearby. In ferns, this process has happened often enough to become one of the great hidden engines behind their overall diversity. It helps explain why the group can be so rich, so variable, and so maddeningly complex to classify cleanly. One species might stand right beside another in the same shaded ravine, looking almost identical at a glance, and yet carry a genuinely different underlying genetic history. This kind of genome duplication turns the fern story into something more than simple gradual refinement. It becomes a tale of occasional dramatic leaps in genetic possibility, moments where entire lineages may have gained new futures simply by duplicating the very blueprint from which they grow. Fern genomes, in fact, can be unusually large and unexpectedly complex. For plants that often seem quiet and understated, ferns can carry astonishingly elaborate genetic archives. Some species possess remarkably large genomes, packed with far more genetic material than most people would ever expect from a modest plant sitting quietly in the shade. Size alone doesn't automatically make a genome more advanced, but it does make it considerably more intriguing. It suggests long histories of duplication, retention, and evolutionary experimentation written directly into the cells of these plants. A fern can look perfectly simple from a distance, and yet inside each individual cell nucleus lies a record of genuine complexity. That contrast is part of what makes them so compelling. The frond itself appears graceful and economical, while the genetic machinery quietly running behind it may be anything but spare. Scientists studying these genomes aren't merely cataloging raw numbers for their own sake. They're peering directly into how ancient plant lineages managed to persist, diversify, and in some cases become wonderfully difficult to fully untangle. In that sense, every single fern carries not only spores and living leaves, but also a vast hidden document of evolutionary history quietly folded up inside it. One particular fern species became genuinely famous for its ability to clean arsenic out of contaminated soil. Most people think of ferns purely as shade-loving decorative plants, not as environmental specialists in any practical sense. Yet one species dramatically changed that perception. A certain brake fern became well known because it can absorb unusually high concentrations of arsenic from polluted ground and store it directly within its own tissues. That ability is genuinely extraordinary. Arsenic is toxic, dangerous to most forms of life in many of its chemical forms, and a serious problem in certain polluted soils around the world. And yet, this particular fern can draw it up through its roots and move it into its fronds at concentrations that would completely overwhelm most other plants. This discovery has made the species genuinely important in the study of phytoremediation, the practice of using living plants to help clean up damaged environments. There's something thrilling in that transformation. A plant once admired mainly for its elegant form becomes part of a genuinely practical answer to real pollution. The fern stops being simply a relic of ancient green worlds and becomes, instead, a modern tool quietly helping humans confront toxic legacies buried in the earth. Some other ferns accumulate metals that would poison most other plants outright. In certain habitats, the surrounding ground contains metal concentrations high enough to make life genuinely difficult for the vast majority of vegetation. And yet some ferns manage not just to survive there, but to actively absorb these elements into their own tissues, at concentrations that seem almost unbelievable. Plants capable of this are called hyperaccumulators, and their existence changes how you think about both soil chemistry and pure survival. What looks like perfectly ordinary greenery may actually be quietly processing nickel, arsenic, or other metals, in ways that would seriously harm more sensitive species. This isn't mere passive tolerance. It's a biological strategy so unusual that it has drawn real interest from ecologists, physiologists, and environmental scientists alike. A fern growing on genuinely harsh ground may be performing hidden chemical work constantly, moving elements through its body that most plants would avoid at absolutely any cost. That gives these particular species a strange kind of toughness. They aren't simply surviving in difficult places. They're actively participating in the underlying chemistry of those places with remarkable boldness. Tiny floating ferns once even helped cool the ancient Arctic Ocean, in what remains one of the most extraordinary episodes in the entire fern story. This sounds almost impossible at first, and yet the idea is genuinely grounded in solid scientific evidence. During a particularly warm interval far back in Earth's history, tiny floating ferns closely related to the small pond species we mentioned earlier spread across the surface of the Arctic Ocean in truly enormous blooms. At that time, the Arctic wasn't the frozen realm we know today at all. It was considerably warmer, more stratified, and genuinely capable of supporting this astonishing carpet of drifting plant life. As those floating ferns grew and eventually died, large amounts of organic material sank down and were buried, locking away carbon that would otherwise have remained actively cycling through the atmosphere. That's the real key to the drama here. A small fern, multiplied across a truly planetary scale, may have helped draw down greenhouse gases from Earth's ancient atmosphere. The image itself is unforgettable. Not towering glaciers, not vast forests, but countless tiny floating plants drifting quietly across ancient Arctic waters, silently taking part in one of the great climate shifts in the planet's long history. Ferns can be small, and yet their consequences can turn out to be enormous. That ancient fern bloom may have genuinely helped change Earth's climate on a global scale. The event is often discussed specifically because of its sheer size and its far-reaching implications. If enough carbon was removed from the atmosphere through the growth and eventual burial of those floating fern masses, the resulting effect could plausibly have been global in reach. Temperatures may have gradually fallen over time, pushing the planet away from a warmer overall state. This possibility is fascinating, because it hands ferns a role in climate history far beyond anything most people would ever imagine on their own. We're used to thinking of climate as the domain of volcanoes, ice sheets, oceans, and atmospheric chemistry alone. And yet here, the story includes small drifting plants spreading across open water and shifting the planet's carbon balance through sheer, overwhelming abundance. It's a genuine reminder that life doesn't merely respond passively to planetary conditions. Sometimes it actively alters them. The bloom itself is long gone now, but the idea it leaves behind remains profound. Tiny plants, acting across a truly vast expanse, may have quietly nudged the entire Earth toward a cooler future. Ferns, in the end, remind us that lasting survival never actually requires flowers. Modern plant beauty is very often judged almost entirely by bloom. We praise petals, fragrance, and fruit, and in doing so we sometimes forget that other strategies remain equally possible. Ferns stand quietly outside that whole system altogether. They never evolved flowers, never needed pollinating insects to perform that particular role, and never packaged their future inside seeds or fleshy fruit. And yet they endured, spread, diversified, and still thrive across a huge portion of the planet today. That makes them wonderfully subversive, in a quiet sort of way. They succeed through an entirely different route, one built on spores, on layered life cycles, on moisture, patience, and pure structural elegance. There's a genuine lesson in that, and it reaches well beyond botany. We're often drawn to the obvious signal, the brightest display, the loudest proof of life. Ferns answer with an entirely different model. They show that persistence can be subtle, that beauty can be built from form rather than bloom, and that one of the oldest, most consistently successful plant groups on Earth achieved all of this without ever producing a single flower of its own. They built their beauty instead from spores, from patience, from water, and from time. That may genuinely be the deepest charm of the whole group. Nothing about a fern's overall strategy feels hurried. It begins with spores too small to notice, with hidden generations tucked close to the ground, with fleeting moisture-dependent moments that demand exactly the right conditions, and with growth that so often feels slow, deliberate, and ancient in its underlying tempo. And yet, From these humble ingredients comes extraordinary beauty. A frond unfurls into delicate lace. A colony spreads slowly into a green tide across the forest floor. A ravine fills with patterns more graceful, in their own quiet way, than many flowering displays could ever manage. The fern doesn't achieve any of this through bold advertisement. It achieves it purely through process. The plant waits, times its moments carefully, persists through hardship, and gradually becomes magnificent almost without announcement. That particular combination of delicacy and patience is genuinely hard not to admire. It feels almost like another entire philosophy of living, quietly made visible in ordinary greenery. These plants were never really built for spectacle in the conventional sense. They were built for endurance and slow, steady unfolding. And somehow that unhurried method produced forms elegant enough that human beings have remained captivated by them for centuries on end. To study ferns closely is really to meet an older style of plant life altogether. They aren't older, simply because they've existed for an extraordinarily long time, though of course they have. They feel older in their fundamental design, in their rhythm, and in the way their entire life cycle still carries clear traces of a world where land plants were solving very different problems than the flowering plants around us solve today. When you study ferns closely, you encounter spores instead of seeds, hidden alternate generations instead of one single obvious body, and a real dependence on freestanding water at certain crucial stages. You begin to genuinely see how life on land once worked, long before flowers rose to dominate so much of our collective imagination. This makes the whole group feel almost like a living archive, not some fossil display sealed behind glass, but an active, breathing style of plant life that still surrounds us on ordinary walks through ordinary places. There's something deeply satisfying in that fact. The fern doesn't merely tell us that the past once existed somewhere far away. It lets us reach out and genuinely touch a surviving version of it. To learn these plants closely is to step, however briefly, into an entirely different botanical logic, one that remains alive, remains beautiful, and remains remarkably effective even now. Ferns make the world around us feel deeper, older, and far more alive than it might otherwise seem. A place changes noticeably the moment ferns are present. A bare rock face becomes something more than simple stone. A woodland floor becomes layered, genuinely inhabited, and almost quietly secretive. Even a damp wall in the middle of a city can start to feel touched by much older processes once fronds begin emerging from its cracks. Part of that effect comes purely from age. Ferns carry ancient associations whether or not we consciously know the underlying science behind them. Part of it comes from their form, because their shapes so strongly suggest hidden growth, cool moisture, and places that aren't fully exposed to the open world. And part of it comes from what they quietly imply about life itself. Wherever ferns grow, conditions tend to be subtle rather than harshly obvious. There's just enough water, just enough shade, just enough continuity for something genuinely intricate to persist there over time. That makes their presence emotionally powerful in a way that's easy to underestimate. They deepen the whole atmosphere of a landscape. They suggest history, shelter, and the ongoing, largely invisible work of life continuing quietly beneath the surface of things. Very few plants manage that so consistently. Ferns don't simply occupy places, they genuinely enrich the feeling of those places. Ferns were, in fact, among the very first plants to truly fascinate modern naturalists. Long before genetics, satellite ecology, or any of today's advanced environmental science, naturalists were already drawn to ferns with a special kind of intensity. Part of that early fascination came from simple accessibility. These plants could be found on ordinary walks through hedgerows, ravines, ruins, and woods, and yet they remained mysterious enough to reward genuinely close study. Their variety was obvious at a glance, but their reproduction was genuinely puzzling for a long time, and people didn't fully understand exactly how such plants managed to multiply. That combination proved irresistible. A fern was common enough to encounter easily, and yet strange enough to keep prompting real questions. This made them ideal subjects for early field observation, careful collection, thoughtful comparison, and genuine amateur science. In a real sense, they helped train entire generations of people to look more carefully at the natural world around them. Identification, habitat, structure, and life cycle all became part of their broader appeal. Ferns weren't simply pretty plants noticed briefly by passing observers. They were among the very species that helped turn casual curiosity into genuinely disciplined natural history. Some ferns can live for many years, growing from a single persistent crown. A crown is the central growing point from which fresh fronds emerge, season after season, year after year, and in certain species that crown can persist for a genuinely long time. Each year, new leaves rise up, old ones fade away, and the plant seems to quietly renew itself while remaining, in a very real sense, the same continuous individual all along. That continuity gives certain ferns a quiet dignity. They aren't simply annual bursts of growth that vanish completely after one cycle. They're steady, ongoing presences, returning from the same central point with a rhythm capable of continuing for years on end. In a garden or a forest, that persistence genuinely changes how you relate to the plant over time. A mature specimen becomes almost companionable, a known familiar presence occupying the same patch of ground through changing weather, occasional damage, and shifting light. The crown itself may thicken, rise slightly, or become more substantial over time, quietly carrying the memory of many past seasons within its own structure. This makes the fern feel less like a passing seasonal flourish and more like a genuinely durable resident, calmly enduring through repeated cycles of unfolding and retreat. Out in the wild, a fern patch may honestly be far older than it first appears to be. What looks at first glance like a modest stand of fresh fronds can be genuinely deceptive. The visible leaves themselves may only be this year's growth, fresh and entirely temporary. But the underlying organism, or the connected colony it belongs to, may have occupied that exact spot for far longer than any casual observer would ever guess. Underground stems can persist for years, crowns can endure for decades, and clonal spread can extend the effective life of a single patch across many seasons, or even much, much longer. That means the fern cluster growing quietly beside a stream, or tucked beneath a stand of trees, may be carrying a history hidden entirely beneath the surface, one that simply isn't visible in the bright, fresh fronds of any given spring. I find that genuinely evocative. The patch looks new because the individual leaves are new, and yet the place itself has been quietly held by the plant for years on end. It gives fern colonies a kind of secret age. They continually renew the visible part of themselves while carefully preserving continuity below ground. What you actually see is simply this year's growth. What you're truly standing beside may be a very old, ongoing occupation of that same patch of earth. Ferns can also colonize old ruins and make weathered stone feel alive again. There's something almost poetic in the sight of fresh fronds emerging from old mortar, from a broken stairway, a cracked wall, or an abandoned well. Stone naturally suggests hardness, age, and stillness. Ferns answer that suggestion with softness, moisture, and active growth. They slip into crevices where dust, rainwater, and organic matter have slowly gathered over time, and then begin the quiet work of turning dead, inert surfaces back into genuine habitat. A ruined structure that once seemed purely architectural gradually starts to feel biological again. The effect is powerful precisely because it joins two very different kinds of time together in a single scene. Human time is written directly into the ruin, in the collapse or slow abandonment of something once carefully built. Deep plant time is written into the fern, in the ancient lineage quietly reclaiming the gap left behind. Together, they create a scene that feels both genuinely historical and genuinely alive at once. This is exactly why ferns can transform old stones so completely. They don't cover it with spectacle. They quietly insinuate life back into it. A wall with ferns growing from it no longer feels finished or abandoned. It feels reopened, in a small but meaningful way, to the living world around it. Some species flourish directly beside waterfalls, living permanently within a constant drifting spray. These are among the most atmospheric fern habitats found anywhere on Earth. Near a waterfall, the air remains almost permanently saturated with fine mist. The rock stays consistently cool and damp, and every nearby surface feels as though it belongs as much to water as it does to solid land. Certain species are beautifully adapted to exactly these conditions. They cling to wet stone, narrow ledges, and shaded rock walls where spray arrives again and again, keeping their tissues hydrated and their surrounding temperature steadily moderated. Seeing them growing there is genuinely unforgettable. The plants seem to belong to a kind of borderland, not fully terrestrial in spirit, and yet clearly not aquatic either. Their fronds catch individual droplets, shimmer gently in the constantly moving air, and make the entire scene feel richer and more vividly alive. This particular habitat also reveals just how precisely some ferns are tuned to very local microclimate conditions. Move even a short distance away from the spray zone, and conditions can shift enough to exclude them entirely. That precision only adds to the fascination. The fern growing beside the waterfall isn't merely enjoying a beautiful setting. It's living exactly where its unusual, specific requirements happen to be perfectly met. Others manage to survive in caves, right at the very edge of true darkness. Very few plants can live deep inside a cave, since photosynthesis still fundamentally requires access to light. And yet near cave entrances, and in chambers where a dim green twilight still lingers, some ferns manage to persist. These aren't plants suited to full, complete darkness. They're plants of the threshold, the exact place where the outside world begins to fade and the underground realm slowly takes over. That liminal existence is genuinely captivating. The air there stays cool, moisture often lingers, and light arrives only weakly, filtered and faint. And yet it's enough. A fern growing at a cave mouth seems to occupy a genuine border between two very different realms, one open and constantly changing, the other stone-bound and largely hidden. It makes the plant feel almost like a quiet guide toward the underworld, still rooted firmly in available sunlight, but willing to press further into the shadows than most other plants ever dare. This particular setting changes the emotional tone of the fern entirely. No longer simply ordinary woodland greenery, it becomes part of a shadowed landscape of dripping water, mineral scent and echo, surviving right where daylight is already beginning to disappear. A fern can genuinely live its entire life high in the canopy and never once touch soil. This is one of the most astonishing ways the whole group manages to escape ordinary expectations. We tend to imagine plants as firmly rooted in the ground, and yet many epiphytic ferns spend their entire lives elevated on trunks and branches, far above the forest floor. They gather water from rain, from drifting mist, and from intercepted debris. They root instead into bark crevices, trapped litter, and small accumulations of organic material held high above the ground. In a sufficiently humid forest, this can create entire aerial gardens where ferns flourish alongside mosses, orchids, and countless other canopy-dwelling plants. The image itself is genuinely thrilling. An ancient plant lineage that most people closely associate with damp ground instead spends its whole existence living within the upper architecture of the forest, suspended in open light and air. And it manages this without ever parasitizing the tree that happens to support it. This makes the canopy feel far less like empty overhead space, and far more like an entirely separate continent of plant life in its own right. A fern can belong completely to that elevated world, spending its whole existence above the earth without ever truly needing to touch it at all. Some genuinely rare ferns survive only on a single island, or within one isolated mountain valley. That level of restriction makes them feel precious in a very real, tangible sense. A species can evolve into such a narrow habitat and become so finely specialized to its exact local conditions that its entire global existence ends up confined to one mountain system, one island, one narrow ravine, or one single valley. Try to imagine that for a moment. Every individual of an entire species, all of its genetic memory, all of its future possibilities, held within one small corner of the world. This kind of extreme localization is fascinating because it reveals just how intimately plant evolution can become tied to a specific place. A particular pattern of mist, a specific local geology, a certain elevation, or a very specific history of shelter may together create exactly the conditions a species needs, and nowhere else on Earth offers quite the same combination. But the real beauty of this arrangement also carries genuine fragility. If that one place changes too dramatically, the species has nowhere broader to retreat to. Ferns like this remind us that biodiversity isn't evenly spread across the map at all. Sometimes an entire lineage ends up entrusted to a single quiet corner of the Earth. Ongoing climate change now threatens a good number of ferns tied closely to cool, wet habitats. For species dependent on consistent shade, moisture, and relatively stable temperatures, a warming and rapidly shifting world can be genuinely disruptive. Cloud layers may shift in elevation over time. Dry periods may stretch out longer than before. Heat may eventually push past what certain ferns can reasonably tolerate, especially those confined to mountaintops, narrow valleys, or spray zones with very little room left to retreat into. This matters because many fern habitats simply aren't easily replaceable elsewhere. A cool ravine lost to gradual drying isn't simply recreated somewhere nearby. A cloud forest, slowly shifting further up a mountain slope, may eventually run out of mountain to climb. In that sense, climate change challenges some ferns not only with direct physical stress, but with a genuinely shrinking geography to live within. The threat feels especially poignant when you consider that these are ancient survivors. Lineages that made it through immense stretches of Earth's history can still find themselves vulnerable when rapid modern change outpaces the specific conditions they've come to depend on. That doesn't make the story hopeless by any means, but it does make it feel genuinely urgent. Ferns connect us to deep time, and now, in a strange way, deep time itself seems to be quietly asking for a bit of our care. Ferns, in the end, are living proof that ancient things can still thrive quietly, without ever needing to announce themselves. That may be the single most beautiful lesson they have to offer us. We live in a world that often celebrates whatever is newest, loudest, and most immediate. And yet ferns represent an entirely different kind of success story. They are old beyond almost any ordinary human sense of comprehension, and still, quietly, they continue. They don't dominate headlines. They don't announce themselves with flowers or fruit. They persist instead through shade, through moisture, through drifting spores, through patient renewal, and through sheer accumulated patience. They spread across bare rock, rise up through steaming rainforests, cling stubbornly to old ruins, float gently across still water, and wait calmly in the forest understory with a quiet confidence earned across truly immense stretches of time. To stand beside one, even for a moment, is to feel that endurance made visible, not some dramatic, sudden immortality, but a slow, steady continuation instead. Ancient doesn't always have to mean fading. Sometimes it simply means refined, tested, and still fully quietly alive. That's exactly why ferns feel so genuinely moving. Once you take the time to really sit with their story. They carry a past far older than our own species can ever truly grasp, and yet they remain a familiar, everyday part of the landscapes around us. They whisper, in their own quiet way, that survival can be modest, elegant, and enduring, all at the very same time. As we come to the close of our journey through the world of ferns tonight, it feels worth pausing for a moment and letting all of it gently settle. We began in a time long before flowers, long before grasslands, long before even the first dinosaurs, back when these ancient plants were already quietly shaping the young earth. And from there we wandered together through rainforests and shaded ravines, across bare rock and drifting open water, into hidden life cycles, delicate spirals, and entire forests built without a single bloom. We followed their story through deep time, through extinction and slow recovery, through quiet persistence and genuinely surprising resilience, and through all of it, they remained exactly what they have always been: patient, intricate, and quietly, steadily alive. If you picture them now, perhaps you can see them a little more clearly than before. Fronds arching softly in gentle layers, coils slowly unfurling in their own unhurried time, green shapes resting quietly in shade, or clinging to weathered stone, or suspended high in a canopy where the air stays cool and still. And now there's truly nothing more you need to do. Let your body grow a little heavier, let your breathing slow just slightly, and allow your thoughts to drift gently, like spores carried on a soft, quiet current, settling wherever they happen to land. Rest here for a while, in this calm green world we've wandered through together tonight. Sleep well, and good night.